working.
So we can go with this one?
Yep, I think we should be good here.
Okay, so we are going to start, Malina. I'm going to start broadcasting and then share it. We are now on live.
Welcome to the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshop teach-in on racial justice protests and social change, connecting local movements from Minneapolis, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. My name is Melinda Lindquist, and I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and I'm one of the ICW co-organizers along with Ron Amanzadi and Haider Tun, and I will be the moderator for this afternoon's event. We have an incredible lineup of community organizers, students, and engaged scholars from across our 3 cities and 4 institutions joining us today. Over the past several years, faculty members across our 4 institutions, the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, have been working together to create spaces for our scholars, students, and communities to be in conversation and work in solidarity. This is our 2nd summer online teach-in. You can find our previous teach-in on policing, public policy, and racial justice on YouTube. You have probably also received a few new emails featuring artists across our 3 cities whose work engages in these critical conversations. Please find more short pieces about their work on our YouTube channel. We look forward to inviting you to an upcoming conversation with these artists in the coming weeks. Before we begin, I want to take a few minutes to thank all of the panelists for joining us today and for working to strengthen the relationships between our colleges and universities and communities. I also want to thank our very generous co-sponsors, the College of Liberal Arts, the Office of the President, the Graduate School, the Center for Community Engaged Learning, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, the Institute for Advanced Study, Howard University, Morehouse College, Spelman College, and the Departments of African American and African Studies, Art, History, Political Science, and Sociology. We also want to offer a special thanks for the administrative support from the Department of History, especially from Amanda Nelson and Brian Peckel, the technical and event support from ICGC and Laura Bell, the programmatic work and technical support of the ICW's graduate RA, Haider Tun. And finally, I want to offer a special thank you to all of our incredible interns who have come to us through the Center for Community Engaged Learning at the University of Minnesota. If you have perused our website, enjoyed the many interviews on our ICW YouTube channel, received any of our many emails, or found us on social media, it is largely due to the incredible work of Lul Buru, Carly Coons, Megan Deutschman, Tam Chow Duong, Kendall Johnson, and Florence Wee. Thank you to everyone who's made this event possible, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. In recent weeks, we have witnessed massive protests across our nation and around the globe in response to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis by the police. While George Floyd's murder was a surprise to some, Mr. Floyd unfortunately joins a long list of Black men and women murdered by police, including Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and so many more. What has been a surprise for some is an all too familiar story in many communities of color. Still, George Floyd's murder has sparked racial justice protests that have raised and transformed local and national awareness of the endemic violence against Blacks. His murder and the hundreds of protests that have followed have generated pressure such that elected officials and policymakers are now addressing long-standing demands for the reform, defunding, and possible abolition of police departments. Those at the forefront of these protest movements are demanding that racial justice replace institutionalized racism. Growing out of the Black Lives Matter movements, the radical notion that Black Lives Matter is transforming the national consciousness. At the same time, these movements have been and continue to be met with violent and repressive government and police responses, with attempts to rebrand protesters as anarchists and terrorists, or narratives that relocate the problem of violence within these social movements, as opposed to within a society that was built on the violation of Black bodies. During this teach-in, we will spend our first hour with the Minneapolis Collaborative, our second hour with our Atlanta Collaborative, and the third hour with our Washington, D.C. Collaborative. You will hear from the engaged students and community leaders who have been on the front lines of protests and community organizing, as well as from engaged and activist scholars who work around these issues and are thinking about the role of higher education in local and national conversations about racial justice protests and social change. Each city will share a part of their story, and each collaborative invites you to be a part of this conversation. We will be collecting your questions throughout this event. Whether you're joining us through Zoom or on our YouTube channel, feel free to share your questions. We welcome your voices in this conversation because these conversations are about our communities and about our lives and about the types of anti-racist and justice-centered futures we are trying to live into and up to. On Zoom, the chat is also open. We invite you to use that space to share your thoughts and suggestions. You can also open up the live transcript if captioning will make this program more accessible and enjoyable. So please sit back, stand up, relax. We look forward to spending the next few hours with you. We hope to educate you, empower you, and inspire you. And we hope that the bridges we're building between our scholars and students and community leaders will strengthen the work that is happening across our cities and throughout the nation around racial justice. So welcome. The Minneapolis Collaborative is going to start us off. Then we'll hear from Atlanta and we'll end our teach-in with Washington, D.C. I am honored to welcome our Minneapolis team, featuring Dr. Rose Brewer, Rahel Haile, Key Alexander, and Amber Jones, each of whom you'll see on the other side of the mural art slide presentation that's going to follow my introduction. Dr. Brewer, a sociologist by training, is a professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. As a social activist and scholar, Dr. Brewer has published extensively on Black feminism, political economy, social movements, and social change. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Morris Alumni Distinguished Teaching Professor Award, the American Sociological Association's Distinguished Teaching Award, and the Rosie R. Johnson Social Justice Award. Rahel Haile, co-founder and executive director of policy and programs at the Minnesota Youth Collective, is dedicated to building the political power of young people. Haile prioritizes co-organizing with BIPOC youth without co-opting their movements. Her work in the community since George Floyd's murder has been focused on working with community members around political education on abolition and policy when defunding the police. Key Alexander is a doctoral student in education, curriculum, and instruction with a focus on culture and teaching at the U, where he also serves as coordinator for the Teacher Scholars of Color program. Alexander comes to Minnesota by way of Philadelphia, where they worked as a community health organizer and advocate to transgender youth. Alexander's work and scholarship centers queer Black feminist thought, transformative justice, abolition, and healing justice. Amber Jones received her BA in African American and African Studies with a minor in political science at the University of Minnesota. She is currently the outreach coordinator for the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, an agency of the state of Minnesota. She has a long history of public service and working for systemic change at multiple levels of government. Before we invite the Minneapolis Collaborative team to join us, we want to share images of some of the murals that now grace many walls in Minneapolis. These murals are created by a BIPOC artist collective, Creatives After Curfew, whose artwork was featured on one of our posters for this event. We thank them for their ongoing work and community leadership and for allowing us to share their work at the start of our program. The slideshow is silent and the Minneapolis presentation will begin immediately after this 2-minute art slideshow.
Good day, everyone. I'm Rose Brewer, Professor of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. Welcome. Let us begin. It's been 2 months since the police murder of George Floyd, 2 months since Minnesota became the epicenter of protest and rebellion. The Floyd killing catalyzed resistance nationally and globally. These protests continue. The activism draws upon the long tradition of Black struggle in the US, and in the Minnesota case, we have to dig deeply, asking the question, how did it come to this? Police murder on the one hand, Black uprising on the other. The question compels us to examine the underpinnings of a state that on the face is white and liberal. Underneath, there is a complicated race, class, and gender dynamic in play. The liberal veneer hides some powerful economic and racial realities. On May 30th, 5 days after the Floyd rebellion began, the Washington Post ran the headline, "Racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation." In the body of the article are these statistics. Median Black family income in Minneapolis was $36,000 in 2018, according to US Census data, while median white family income was $83,000. Black families earned only 44% of white income, a $47,000 disparity or gap. The numbers are damning. While Minnesota in 2018 had some of the lowest white poverty rates in the country, it was one of the worst for Black folk. Their poverty rates were at 32%. The white poverty rate was 6%. The national figure for Black population was 26%. Attention has been drawn to these disparities, especially in the wake of the multiple police killings over the last 5 years in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the suburbs. Yet the economic order in which racism is rooted in the state is not even whispered. It is a racialized capitalist state built on white settler colonialism that initiated the territory with the removal and genocidal land appropriation of the Dakota peoples on whose lands we stand. Its logic continued into the current period, structured in the ongoing practices of white supremacism and economic dispossession, in the protection of capital's property, policing instantiated in these structured inequalities. Professor Christopher Lehman, in his recent book, Slavery's Reach, unearths the invisibility of the early features of Minnesota's racialized political economy. Lehman, quote, stated, indeed, investment wealth poured into Minnesota territory from the northeastern US, money made in banking and the industries that grew because of the labor of enslaved Africans, investments in slave labor and in Black bodies, slavers brought to the Minnesota lands. Sociologist Joe Fagan articulates the national logic of slavery and racialized capital, drawing briefly from his quote, without slave labor, it seems likely that there would have been no successful textile industry. And without the cotton and textile industry, it is unclear how or when the United States would have become a major industrial power. There was not a New England merchant of any prominence who was not then directly or indirectly involved in the slave trade. Let me re-articulate Fagan's observation in the context of Minnesota, again drawing upon the valuable work of Slavery's Reach. Quote, a slave-holding financier provided much of the capital behind the fur trade in southern and central Minnesota. Military officers, federal appointees, commuting businessmen, small farmers, banks and insurance companies, hotel keepers and land speculators benefited from slave-holding wealth. A pillar, thus, of the state's foundation cannot be disconnected from unfree labor, inculcated in white supremacist ideology. Alexander Ramsey, Minnesota's first territorial governor, 1849 to 1853, second state governor, 1860 to 1863, and a US senator, 1864 to 1875, saying this of the Dakota peoples: the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated. Ideologies of inferiority and superiority would be embedded in Minnesota social practices, if not always in the law. Black Minnesotans have been in a continual struggle against systemic racism in the state. By the 1910s into 1950, blatant restricted covenants in housing kept Black Minnesotans from living in white neighborhoods in Minneapolis. African-American students were unable to live on campus at the University of Minnesota, an institution that actually obtained a loan from a slave owner to keep afloat in the early years. Black workers have continually been excluded from well-paid construction, electrical, unionized, and professional work. Jobs, wages, and economic assets are denied or bifurcated by race, low paid or no paid, a Black tax. While Minnesota has prided itself on having a small group of well-paid Black elites in the corporations that dominate the landscape of the Twin Cities. In the summer of 1967, the Black community on the north side of Minneapolis rose up, expressing similar ills to the current protest. Economic dispossession plays out over the decades. Capitalism and racism inextricably linked in the state. Black homeowners were especially hurt during the 2007 and 2008 recession, with predatory lending by banks such as Wells Fargo hitting the Black population hard in the Twin Cities, where the home ownership rate for the Black population is 29%, for the white population, 75%. Minneapolis is a capitalist city. The protection of property is paramount while keeping some Minnesotans, quote, safe, built into the logic. When elite self-interest and social interests are so aligned with racialized economic dispossession, this is intractable ground, requiring political opposition. And so the Floyd Rebellion rose up as another generation stands in the ready in protests for Black lives in Minnesota and beyond. Thank you. We will now turn to our first speaker, Rahel Hali, who is the founding director of Minnesota Youth Project, and will get into, in more specific ways, how movement building happens with young people in the state of Minnesota. Rahel?
Yes, thank you, Rose. Thank you, Dr. Rose. As Dr. Rose said, my name is Rahel Haile, and I'm going to be talking about three things. One is how we got here politically and the hoops that Black people, and especially young Black people, have had to jump through in order to get here, and the general culture of Minnesota in that. Then we'll talk about young people's response to the Floyd murder and how not only have folks led movements and led the uprising here, but also how they've led behind the scenes. And then we'll talk a little bit about sustainability and how we can pass on knowledge to young folks in the ways in which we're organizing. So first, how we got here politically. I think first, as Dr. Rose said, that there is an undercurrent of passive aggressiveness in our state. We, tout a lot of Minnesota nice here, and I think that can maybe spread throughout the Midwest, but a lot of folks, especially white folks, hold Minnesota nice near and dear to their hearts. I think first off, to talk about elected officials and folks in power, there is a deep need to be liked here, and there is a deep need to live up to what people are asking for on all sides. And so, even right now, there were articles coming out about how Minnesota already abolished their police department. And I want to say, first of all, that is not true. And say that first, with our elected officials, it became we need to abolish the police, and had elected officials say that explicitly. Then it went to, we are going to defund the police. And then it went to taking 1.1 million off of the city's police budget when the demand was 45 million. This is a highlight of how the directness that is needed from our leaders is not happening, and that we need, and that is why we need organizing, and that is why young folks rose up in this moment. I was talking to someone about Minnesota earlier this morning, and they said something really great that I wanted to tell you all, and that is, in Minnesota, calling someone racist is the not nice thing, not that racism isn't nice. The fact that you call it out is not the nice thing, and that the racism is expected. I then want to talk about how, with this culture and with jumping hoops for years and years with elected officials, and how we got here. So young folks got frustrated with bringing up legislative solutions, with not being listened to and being talked down to about their lived experiences, because the need is for experts, and lived experiences is not what is important in our state. And generally, I would also say, with elected officials and people in power. And so the lived experiences of young Black folks in Minnesota have not been listened to for years on end. So the response: young Black folks led the uprising in Minnesota. And I think that is because of the hoops that they had to jump through. But I also want to highlight more so what happened behind the scenes. What I saw and joined from the leadership of young Black folks was that there were group chats and organizing hubs for different spaces. There was, and still is, a group that's talking about community safety and how we take care of our own when our police department is not taking care of us. Then, there was a thing around food and how we can care for organizers as well as the general public and the people who are unhoused in this moment because of our housing crisis, as well as our policing problem. And then also there was White Supremacist Watch and all of these other spaces where I was incredibly proud to be a young Minnesotan and a young Black Minnesotan, because I think that folks have really risen up in this moment to be able to respond and say that jumping through these hoops and talking to these elected officials is actually not working because we are not being taken seriously. And this is a plight for young folks throughout all of the country. But I would also say the culture of Minnesota that I highlighted at the beginning and that Dr. Rose highlighted makes young Minnesotans even more frustrated with the nature of our state and the nature in which things move. An elected official or a person in power or just a general Minnesotan will never tell you what is up and what is happening, and will actually pander to what you are saying, and behind your back will change the move, as we highlighted and as has been highlighted by the response to the demand to abolish the Minneapolis Police Department. I then want to talk a little bit about the sustainability of movements based on these young folks and based on this moment and moments past. I am an organizer who started in the time of our 4th Precinct uprising, which someone else will talk about, in 2016. That is when I became the most politically active. And I think to highlight my own experience and then have that highlight other people's experiences, I almost left being an organizer. I almost left being a person in movement because of the strain that it takes on folks who are leading. And I wasn't even leading in that moment in 2016. And so I will say that as folks who are, I call on folks who are panelists on this teach-in, and I call folks generally to think about how you are passing on knowledge to other folks who are leading movements in this moment. I think about the leadership development of our young folks and how we can not recreate the wheel over and over again, and actually have folks who can teach lessons to others so that when they are on the front lines, they are not alone, and that they are not only basing things off of their own knowledge, but are basing things off of 2016, basing things off of 2000, basing things off of the 1990s and the 1980s. We need to be better at passing on knowledge to young folks, and especially young Black folks who are leading movements in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahel. We're going to move along and consider organizing and policy change at the state level and beyond. Amber Jones, an honors graduate of the University of Minnesota, Department of African American and African Studies, yay, will speak to us around these issues. She is currently the outreach coordinator for the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage. Amber.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Professor Brewer, for introducing me into being one of my core teachers at the university. And as was alluded by Rahel, I'm actually going to spend some time kind of walking us through the past 5 years and looking at how organizing has developed in the modern Black Lives Matter movement in the Twin Cities area. I think a lot of times our history gets kind of lost in the sauce. And so with the exception of Philando Castile, which I will touch on, but I think it's important to see some of the connecting threads to explain a little bit of how we got here And then I'm also going to touch a little bit on some of the work that I'm currently involved in at the state, and just talk about, some of like what are we supposed to be doing as a public sector in response, to also address some of the things that Rahel also highlighted in her presentation. So I want to take us back to 2015, specifically November 15th, early in the morning in North Minneapolis, on Plymouth Avenue, which is a historic strip in the area. There are a lot of Black legacy organizations and institutions that have been on that strip. And also it has seen its share of protests as well with the Plymouth uprisings in the 1960s. On November 15, 2015, Jamar Clark was killed in an officer-involved struggle a few blocks down from a lot of those core institutions, as well as the 4th Precinct in North Minneapolis. Early in the morning, a number of Black youth, Black women, Black queer, trans individuals took occupation of the lobby of the 4th Precinct Police Station, which then turned into an 18-day occupation 24/7, which effectively shut down the 4th Precinct for that time. A lot of major organizations in the area were part of that work, including the Black Liberation Project, Black Lives Matter Minneapolis Chapter, the NAACP, Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, and other groups. And this was really the first major occupation or decrease in operation that I have seen of a police precinct in this modern Black Lives Matters movement. And I really want us to take some time when you log off to really investigate that further, so you know that that is a core piece of our history in this movement that we need to have committed to memory. As Rahel mentioned, there were a lot of young Black people who really stepped into activism during that time and started to grow in their leadership, in their activism during that particular occupation and moving forward. And that's where we start to see a lot of an increase of protests throughout the cities and shutting down of highways and really developing people's organizing skills, trying to fight for Jamar Clark. And then less than a year later, in July of 2016, Philando Castile was murdered in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. And this was really the first police murder in Minnesota during the modern Black Lives Matter movement. So I will really say like from 2013 on, that really sparked some national outrage. And so that is when we started to see a lot of people focusing on Minnesota. We also saw some more decentralization in our protests, focusing on targeting spaces like the governor's mansion, other spaces throughout the cities. We had this major incident occur in Minneapolis and now in St. Paul. So where's the justice in the Twin Cities, the tale of two cities, the tale of oppression in the midst of prosperity in Minnesota, right? We saw a continuous growth in movement organizations. We saw an expansion of different Black Lives Matter chapters moving on at that time. And as we move forward into the next few years, we start to see a lot of people in the community who were deep in the organizing space. They started to run for office. They started to run and win at the local, the county, and the state level. And a lot of that is playing into where we are today. A lot of the people that are in certain spaces, specifically at the local level, are people who have been part of this movement. So what does leadership and accountability look like in 2020 when some of the same people who have been on the quote unquote front lines or been a part of this movement are now in spaces of influence? How does leadership and accountability look in this moment? So as we move into 2020, on May 25th, when George Floyd was murdered, something that we need to take account of as to why this incident has become so central to our movement at this time, not just with the actual video of his murder, but also the state of Black Minnesotans at this time, where we have the concentrated traumas of the COVID-19 pandemic that is ravaging our communities. And I have to, as a state official, a state agency professional, have to look at the data on a regular basis and keep up with what's going on at the state level. We are one of the most disproportionately affected groups in the state when it comes to our case rates, and that is also across the country. And as of right now, 50%, 1 in 2. If we look at our Minneapolis group right now, 2 of us would be in this position. We would not have a job. This is the highest rate of unemployment for Black people we've ever seen in the state. So as we look into moving into the uprising of this time, I just want to show some connecting threads. So as you may have seen, and now the Star Tribune came out with an article saying that the instigation of the looting and the destruction of property and buildings was instigated by white supremacists. Anybody in Minnesota, especially Black, would have told you we already knew that, but you know how it goes. Seeing the destruction of the 3rd precinct and seeing being able to see the taking down of an institution of physical manifestation of police state violence, that has connecting threads, as I said, to the 2015 with the 4th precinct occupation. We are seeing, some of our leadership as they have been building their leadership over the past 5 years, really be in a position today to really be in a critical and important space for where we're going to move forward. Protests are becoming even more decentralized. We're seeing protests pop up in Burnsville and Roseville and Apple Valley. These are suburbs of the Twin Cities that honestly people would never associate with a Black Lives Matter protest before. And then also the impact of shifting political representation. And so at the city council level, we now have a supermajority that really pushed for that vote to start to defund the police, and an increase of council members who have been a part of these current movements, as I said. But we're also navigating some nuances and some struggles in that work as they are situated in spaces of influence. So what does, like I said, accountability look like in this new era where maybe 5 years ago we had a much different makeup at our city council, at the county level as well, and at the state level. And as I wrap up my time, just talking about at the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, which is a state agency, we push for 3 things in the time that we had to allow Keith Ellison to prosecute the case for a civil rights investigation and for licensing changes. We were able to get all those fulfilled, but we know that there is a long way to go. We're still battling with how our protest movements are addressed and read by people in leadership. It took us 2 months to even get a police reform package passed in a divided legislature. And really just saying with how do we take the requests and the demands from the community and make it real in a space of ongoing governance, right? And so as I wrap up, I'm really excited for Key's talk as he talks about how do we make this work really come alive? What does it look like on the other side of abolishing the police? So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Amber, so much for your insights and comments. And finally, we'll hear from Key Alexander. Key is a doctoral student in education, curriculum, and instruction with a focus on culture and teaching. Key brings to our discussion today deep insight into issues of personal liberation and healing, and will take us home with his scholarship as well as his activism. Key?
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, and thank you to the ICW team for inviting me here today. Before I start, I would just like to invite everybody with us to take a collective breath. A big inhale and letting it out. Yeah, thank you so much for my panelists and my Minneapolis team. So as I've been sitting and hearing other folks talk, something that's really come up to me is thinking about what is the other side, like Amber alluded to, what are the things that make movements sustainable? How are we refueling the movement? And how do we survive the aftermath of everything that's happened? Our city is completely different now. And so what are the things to make that kind of go along? So some of the things that we've been seeing happen on an amazing scale is mutual aid. mutual aid being a framework of developing support networks for folks to survive outside of relying on the state, right? And so there are these moments where lots of young people are on the front lines, and part of like, how do people keep showing up to protest every day? After the murder of George Floyd, there were literally people in the street every day. And part of that was behind the scenes, how to make sure that organizers were being fed. Organizers created free testing sites so that people who had been to protest could go get tested for COVID-19. People were doing supply runs, not just food, but also diapers and formula for mothers and children, first aid supplies, all that. And also the area in which George Floyd was murdered has been reclaimed by the community as a sacred space and a memorial and a vigil that has had volunteers, food, supplies constantly since the murder has happened. And so Minneapolis has been working towards these huge scopes of mutual aid in new ways that I've never seen before. So the city of Minneapolis is already practicing in real time what it would look like without the police state, right? And so while there was protests happening, there were fires being set in neighborhoods, white supremacists running around, and people were not necessarily like, people would call the police and the police were not coming. And so to even, folks in the neighborhood who had an attachment to police and the idea of safety were recognizing that they were not following through. And so what happened was community-wide responses to that lack of response. So we had, kind of like Rahel mentioned before, community safety teams, people talking to their neighbors and community members in in-depth ways, doing community-wide political education, talking about what defunding the police really means, what would it mean to resource education, food, as well as housing. Minneapolis is also experiencing a huge housing crisis at the moment. And one of the things that happened during the uprisings was a local hotel had been taken over to house a lot of houseless folks, and was brought together by a group of volunteers, and folks were really trying to make it happen, coordinate it, make sure that people were safe. And it was a huge effort and a large scale. Oftentimes we see mutual aid happening in communities, in small knit communities. There's lots of mutual aid as a framework has been long practice in Black communities, particularly around supporting folks around medical costs, education, funerals, any type of kind of family emergencies where Black communities will pool resources together to support folks. And that is some of the mutual aid that we're seeing today. So, this also included having a people's ambulance, a people's fire brigade, food, people's laundry service, and supplies. And so what I'm seeing, which I think is really amazing, is one, that people are recognizing that to keep our movement sustainable, we have to also be making sure that we're taking care of people's basic needs. And whether that be food, housing, education, these things are being ramped up in real time. I'm also seeing the ways that Minneapolis is slowly starting to detach the notion of safety from the police state, right? Black and brown communities know that police are often coming into our communities and causing more harm. They do not prevent crime, they react to crime. And also we know that our communities are criminalized for things that happen in other communities all the time. So I'm really appreciative and humbled by the way that I'm seeing that people really start to interrogate what they mean by safety and what they mean by community. I really think this is this kind of practicing of abolitionist futures in real time, right? If we already know that we can work with our community members to keep our localized neighborhoods safe, if we know that we can work with others to make sure that people get their basic needs met, if we know that we're doing political education so that people understand what we actually mean by defunding the police, and working to talk to their cousins and neighbors who are both in the city and without, and within the state, we're actually practicing abolitionist futures in real time. And so I think as we're moving forward, we're also seeing a shift in, we had a lot of rapid response happening. And now we're seeing how people can create more sustainable networks to support folks moving forward. And I think the thing that has been really amazing and humbling to me is seeing that youth are also learning these principles, right? Youth are on the ground, having an embodied way of knowing about what it means to keep showing up, to fight the fight, but also to make sure that we're taking care of each other in principled struggle. So as I'm, looking forward to hear from our comrades in DC and Atlanta, I'm really grateful to see the ways that Minneapolis is showing an example for the national scale of ways that we can be able to support each other and operate without the police state. That's what I have, and I'm so grateful to everybody for inviting me and for our team. And we'd like to invite everybody. We'll have a 2-minute break, and we would love to take your questions after this 2-minute break.
Thank you. As we jump into the first Q&A, I want to encourage everybody to stretch, to stay hydrated, and to remind you that we're 1/3 of the way through our program. And I also want to thank the Minneapolis Collaborative for their very powerful presentations, and thank the audience for their questions. Please continue to submit questions. So against the backdrop of Minnesota's progressive claims about itself, Professor Brewer really sets the scene of incredible racial disparities in Minneapolis, in a state that is built on white settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and she also links it to the stories of slavery's a very long reach into Minnesota and the ways in which white supremacy is institutionalized throughout our state. She reminds us that the fact that Minneapolis is an epicenter of these movements should not be a surprise.
Rahel Haile then really did a lovely job laying out the shifting political terrain and the lack of clear direction from Minnesota's leaders. She also talked about the power of youth responses, especially the ways in which youth have really stepped up in terms of leadership around issues of safety and food, and also about the challenges in a movement and in this movement and sustaining this movement, and really the importance of knowledge transfers and self-care. Amber Jones then shared the recent history of protest, especially reminding us about the early occupation of the police department following the murder of Jamar Clark, and also responses to the murder of Philando Castile. And she asked, how does leadership and accountability change when movement leaders also become elected officials? And what is the role of the public sector in these movements, especially in light of COVID and the economic crisis? And then Alexander rounded out that presentation by having us consider the ways in which our city has already changed, especially beyond the parameters of the state and the public sector, and largely in terms of mutual aid. Key reminds us that Minneapolis is already living into a vision of itself beyond policing. The city and its communities are using models in this moment, models that are in many ways quite familiar to communities of color, these mutual aid models. And Key reminds us that safety does not hinge on the police state. And so thank you for submitting your questions. I'm going to start us off with one of our first questions, which is, what do we do when people say that movements like these are just political movements? And though there is sort of a call for change, that really this movement is just a certain type of political response to the current person in the White House, to President Trump.
I can take a shot at that if anyone else wants to, please do also. But I would assert that we are in a particular, what I would call conjuncture, a coalescing of social, political, and historical issues that are unique in space and time. And that it's a bit of a misreading to say that we're only dealing with a response to Trump and Trumpism. Certainly that plays a role, but the expansiveness of the response, not only within Minneapolis and Minnesota, but globally, signals, from my perspective, a new moment. Now, that moment can go in a number of places, and thanks to Amber for lifting up the accountability question. Certainly there's some very deadly possibilities. And we've seen in response to some of the protests in Oregon and in the Washington state area that the use, and that happened of course here in the Floyd uprising, that the military and militarism is not far away. But I do think we're dealing with something that's deeper and perhaps more sustaining. All of it will depend on us in terms of many of the things that our panelists have articulated, how we organize, with whom we organize, how we prepare young people as both political actors as well as folk who are willing to throw down, to use an expression. So I would just leave it at that, and perhaps other panelists would like to respond.
Yes, I will also hop in. Thank you for your response, Professor Brewer. I just want to loop us back to my presentation about the history. And so any type of response saying that this is just to rebel against Trumpism is not really founded in the history. To just to be frank, the Black Lives Matter movement actually started during the Obama administration, during a time where we thought there was going to be immense change in our country. And yes, we saw some, but when it comes to the changes that Black people needed, there are a lot of people who, struggle with that idea that Black people got what they needed during that administration, right? And so if we look back at the history, and the history is, I'm not asking for us to go that far back. I'm literally like saying within a decade, that is just unfounded. And so this is a call to making sure that political education is a part of the work that we're doing in our movement spaces. People don't have an excuse not to know what has happened in our country and in our local communities. And so making sure people have been educated on the work that has been done even in this past decade to lift up police brutality and the attack from police state violence on Black lives, I think is essential. There's a lot of organizations doing that work. A book that comes to mind is Making All Black Lives Matter by Professor Barbara Ransby. It's an amazing book, and it's a short read. And really does highlight some of the organizing in this movement at a very, high level to get that information. But we don't have an excuse to just to know things that we don't know for the sake of not knowing them. We have so much opportunity to learn and to grow and to be well-versed so that we can combat some of that language coming out from people in the community saying that, oh, this is just to go against Trump, and this is just this, and this is just a political moment of the time. No, this is transcending politics. This has transcended politics, and we are in a very leaning fascist administration, but we were also a part of a progressive administration, and this still continued. And so this is transcendent of what is happening in American politics. This is really about human rights and what's happening to Black people in this country.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I just wanted to add quickly that I also think that there's a moment for us and an opportunity to reframe what we mean by political, right? Because I think that white supremacy creates the conditions where white folks get to choose what is political for their lives and not. And Black folks are not afforded that, right? Like, our lives are political because there are things that happen politically to us that impact our everyday lives that we cannot escape, in a way that white folks have the opportunity to say, oh, this is political, and so I'm not going to touch that, right? And so I really challenge people to reframe what they think about what political means, to think about how they can step into this movement in this moment.
Thank you so much. We have another question from our audience. Can you tell us how we can plug into the abolitionist movement here in Minneapolis? I'm familiar with Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective. Are there other organizations that we should be following? Also, how might those of us in the suburbs engage, given that the focus is on Minneapolis right now?
I can take a stab at this if other panelists want to jump in after me. But I think first off, in a purely logistical standpoint, I know that Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective are looking for folks to participate in a street team, to participate in this political education and be talking to folks in Minneapolis about what abolishing the police would look like, and do some work around that. So purely logistical, if you want to get involved in that way, that is a way that I would highlight that. I think other organizations are taking the lead of Black Visions and Reclaim the Block, and are looking to partner in specific ways that are relevant to their organizations. I think we're as folks who are in progressive movement and also work in nonprofit, trying to not recreate the nonprofit industrial complex, and really not trying to take credit for other people's work. And so I would say that in my organization, the Minnesota Youth Collective, we're talking about how, as an organization that does engage somewhat in elections, how can we be the ones to be talking to folks about a potential charter amendment in 2020? And how can we be those folks to be talking to them? Because we see that as our role in talking about abolition. And then also, as a Black-led but multiracial organization, how can our organization be talking to non-Black POC folks and also white folks from the white folks in our organization about how abolition works as well, and assisting those organizations with that effort.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you now kind of a little bundle of questions that I think a range of you will be really interested in engaging with. So, given the violent racist history that Professor Brewer so eloquently describes, do you think that we need a policy of reparations in Minnesota or across the country? And if so, what do you think it would look like? Do you think that it's possible? So a question about reparations. Another question about how can we hold elected officials accountable given their sort of failures in the past? And do we think that street protests and community organizing is sort of sufficient to do that work? Or do we also need to go really focus also on mobilizing youth voters? And then a final question, which is about mutual aid. And can mutual aid completely replace the government safety net that has been really eviscerated over the past several years? Or do we see mutual aid more as a supplement to that safety net?
That's quite a bundle of questions, Melinda. I'll take a stab at the reparations question. It is quite clear to me and to a number of others that a tremendous debt is due, that a reckoning around uncompensated enslaved labor, 100 more years of Jim Crow, and here we are in the 21st century talking about mass incarceration, police murder, and the dismal economic location of a people who more and more are dispossessed, and whether or not any of us will be needed very much in the near future certainly is a consideration. And I do think we need to be putting the idea, not necessarily of funds in the pocket, but a different vision of what it means to build Black life in this country. I think any sound rationale would include a reparations component to it, but it's not the end of the story. I have been so pleased to hear that so much of the struggle is about imagining futures, about a vision. So that means if you're going to imagine a future, you have to build that revolutionary road with many things along the way, including perhaps a whole coterie of different kinds of mutual aids, which prepare the road for a different kind of society. So movement building and organizing and building a different order for the people and the planet, these are all pieces of something that we're going to be with for a while. And I know in this country we have a kind of short memory and a kind of, what would I call it, immediate gratification. But I think all of us on this panel have an eye on the longer haul, are not deluded by thinking this is done. But a clarion call, a profound message has been sent in living and graphic color that I don't think we can ever forget. There were other pieces to that. Maybe Key wants to take on the issue of the state and mutual aid. So that's all I have for the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a great question about the mutual aid. So, I mean, the reality is that the social safety net is already disintegrated for a lot of communities. I think a lot of where I've learned from mutual aid has been from sick and disabled queer and trans folks of color, and who are folks who you are not, there is no safety net for those communities. And so mutual aid has literally been the structure that has helped people survive. So I think that, you know, I also don't know that it's helpful to put it in a binary of replace or supplement as much as it is like, this is the thing that people need to do to be well and survive while the state is still working out their things. Obviously, it would be wonderful if we had a state structure that did have a social safety net, but we're seeing that that really only exists for a very small population of people in this country. So yeah, I think that it can certainly, I think that what I'm seeing in Minneapolis is that I've actually never seen the scale of which we've done Minneapolis in, or what we've done mutual aid like this. And so for me, that gives me a lot of hope that we can really start to build out these large scale mutual aid networks that really have a much larger impact rather than these very small localized things. So that gives me hope.
I'll go briefly on the accountability question. I do agree with Keith, particularly because my experience in government is that government is very slow, very, very slow. And the beauty of mutual aid is that it is very rapid in its response. And so we need to have that as a mechanism in our community to address pressing and urgent needs when it comes to the safety and stability of people's lives. And so just wanted to highlight that. But when it comes to holding leadership accountable, particularly in the government spaces, we need that, and we need people to be engaged in that work alongside of doing the advocacy and the activism, because I would just say from my vantage point that a lot of these elected officials are really relying on community members and community leaders when it comes to being able to carry their priorities in a government space where there are people in power that do not care for the work that needs to be done in our communities. And it's very difficult at times to carry that work. And sometimes we make the assumption that, okay, we voted those people in, they need to go do the work and I don't need to deal with it. And in some ways that is true. Like, we should be able to trust you in this representative democracy to be able to carry that work. But depending on what the composition is in some of these government spaces, sometimes we have to work harder to advocate for the things that we know is right. And so to be able to have a body like the council, to be able to focus specifically on making sure that our government is being reflective of the needs of our community brings an extra level of capacity that's really needed to do this work in a state that is largely very white and very focused on, maintaining that culture of whiteness throughout the state. And also with the other ethnic councils as well, representing different communities of color, indigenous groups, and the Disability Council as well. And so I was having like a brief exchange with a friend of mine this morning, and we need that inside-outside strategy, long story short, as someone who has been in the advocacy space and also in the government space. The two don't have to be in silos. In some ways, we have to have some ways of working together in that space. And that also means when we're not doing our job in government, y'all need to hold us accountable. Y'all need to make some noise and push for change. But we have to get to a point where we don't have to do that work so heavily to hold people accountable, that we can have a representative democracy that actually works for the people that it serves. And then also when it comes to youth mobilization in voting, just real briefly, because I know this is more Rahal's lane, but to just elevate the fact once again that she said earlier in her presentation that youth have been leading this work. And so we have to be concerned about making that connecting point that just as much as you're leading this activism work, and I've done work in education, organizing in the past as well, and have worked with young people, just so you are lifting up this work for change, we also need to ensure that we can lift up who are going to be the change makers in some of these spaces as well. We have to continue to make those connecting threads to be able to really be led by what the youth solutions are in this space, and making sure there are people in these spaces of influence that are going to consider and to center youth voice in that work as well.
Do I have time for a quick comment, Melinda?
One quick comment.
Yeah, I really want us to steer away from a dichotomous opposition along the lines that the panelists have spoken to. But I think it's even more complicated than there's the government and there's the protest. We're dealing with a particular kind of society that I tried to articulate, where money and power really keep the system going, whether it's in a liberal, so-called progressive arena of a state like Minnesota, or more broadly, as we're looking at what's happening at the national level and the white nationalist push there. But if we're serious about political and social change, we're going to have to begin to think about a different kind of social order. That's for another day and a deeper conversation. Certainly built into that is us being responsible for one another in a society where it's strictly run by individualism. So there's good practice. But the structures that we need involving cooperative economics, solidarity economies, those are issues that I hope in our conversations across our collaboration can be taken up. So I will shut up because I know I'm far past time.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. I really want to thank our Minneapolis Collaborative. I want to thank Dr. Rose Brewer, Rahel Haile, Key Alexander, and Amber Jones for the work that you were doing and for this fabulous presentation and excellent Q&A section. I'd now like to introduce our Atlanta team. And I do want to remind everyone that as with our previous segment, we will be collecting your questions on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Please send those in. Our presenters are very happy to be in conversation with you, and the chat also will remain open. I am honored to introduce our Atlanta Collaborative. They are Dr. Adrienne Jones, Dr. Celeste Lee, Sophia Howard, and Mary Pat Hector. Dr. Adrienne Jones is an attorney and assistant professor of political science at Morehouse College. Dr. Jones's research focuses on the Black political experience. Her PhD thesis, which she's revising for publication in various research journals right now, explores the development and influence of colorblind conservatism, both on the federal government and on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dr. Celeste Lee is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at Spelman College. Dr. Lee's research explores how racialization processes are experienced and understood within ethno-racial groups. Her dissertation, Portraits of Black Millennials' Understandings of Racial Dynamics in the 21st Century, and her recent piece, Advocacy, Mentoring, Communicative Responses to Diversity in Higher Education. Both of these interrogate how race and ethnicity, both as experience and ideology, impact youth. Sophia Howard is a senior at Spelman College, where she is a comparative women's studies major and philosophy minor. Howard is also a social justice fellow and founder of Unlocked Minds, which is a book club in Whitworth Women's Facility, a minimum and medium security prison in Hartwell, Georgia. She's particularly interested in the intersections of white supremacy and patriarchy, especially as they cohere around the reproductive rights of incarcerated women. Mary Pat Hector is a graduate of Spelman College and a current graduate student at Georgia State University. Hector serves as a program strategist at RISE and is the Georgia Black Youth Vote Coordinator. From organizing hunger strikes and rallies to end police violence, Hector has been engaging in community organizing for nearly a decade. She is a Peace First Fellow due to her national campaign initiative, Think Twice, which educates youth on nonviolence and provides teen safety workshops, as well as youth advocacy training for schools and youth. Thank you so much. I am very pleased to hand this over to Dr. Jones.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Atlanta. We'd like to thank ICW and you for the opportunity to talk to you today about racial justice, protest, and social change. I am from Morehouse College, and it is an institution dedicated to the education of Black men. And my colleagues are from Spelman College, which is an institution that lives next door, is dedicated to the education of Black women. And we are both a part of the Atlanta University Center, which is a consortium of historically Black colleges and universities. And I'd like to argue that HBCUs are dedicated to Black lives, and that as a result, HBCUs here in Atlanta and nationwide are by their very existence and through their work, acts of protest. Today, I want to talk to you about protests on the street and protest at the ballot box. I want to argue, or alternatively remind all of us, that protest and voting lie on a continuum, that protest is a valid constitutional form of political expression, and that voting is a tool that we can use to forward the Black Lives Matter agenda. This is because protest expands the potential policy proposals available in the electoral realm, as we've heard some from Minneapolis already this morning. Protest also breeds potential candidates who might become elected representatives and better represent Black people and their lives. We saw some of this happen during the Civil Rights Movement, right? Civil rights movement activity resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, among other things. And it produced leadership like John Lewis, who served as a representative to the US House for 17 terms. So I think it's important that we understand and respect protest and its power and its relationship to elections. And in order to do this, I want to talk about two things. One, I want to review some definitions. And then I want to talk about voting and voter suppression in the state of Georgia and in Atlanta. I have 5 definitions. The first is protest. And protest is when people demonstrate or engage in symbolic public expression of objection, disapproval, or dissent, and usually that's political. And I want to point out that people protest in the streets when they need to be heard because the government isn't listening to them, or it isn't listening to their community, and it isn't responding to their needs. The First Amendment of the US Constitution provides the right to free speech, and free speech specifically means the right to criticize the government. And that includes the right to protest. This means that the local and national protests that we're doing now against state-sanctioned police brutality is specifically allowed. It's encouraged, in fact, by the First Amendment, which provides the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Number 2, riot. Riots are noisy demonstrations caused by groups or crowds of people protesting another group, government policy perhaps, but riots may or may not rise to the level of violence. Violence, number 3, according to the World Health Organization, is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Now, these are injuries to bodies and to minds, importantly. Property damage, on the other hand, is injury to real or personal property. So we're talking about injury to inanimate objects, cars, statues, buildings, the CNN Center. Property damage, however, is not violence. Why am I talking about these 4 definitions? Because I think they get used interchangeably, number 1, and I think they're used negatively to negativize the idea of protest. And when protest is cast as negative or necessarily riotous or necessarily violent, it provides justification for a defensive position to be taken by law enforcement, and sometimes for a ratcheting up of that defense. Like right now, we're seeing federal troops disappearing people off the street in the city of Portland. Negativity in the use of these terms devalues the importance of what people are trying to accomplish through protest. So I want to urge us all to pay attention to these terms, the relationship between the concepts, and I want us to be vigilant about how these terms are used in the government, in the media, and how we ourselves use these terms. Finally, I want to talk about white supremacy, which is the belief that white people are superior to those of all other races, and that therefore white people and white needs should dominate our society. And in the United States, with white supremacy, we're speaking specifically about Black Americans. White supremacy undergirds our nation's social, economic, and political foundations historically, and has proven to be extremely resilient and very resistant to challenge. Traditionally, white supremacy meant that Black people didn't have any rights, right? No citizenship, no right to vote, no right to protest, no protections from the Bill of Rights. So this means that protest, even when it's nonviolent, is considered an inherent affront to white supremacy, right? It's problematic because it openly opposes law and order, and it openly opposes the habitual social, economic, and political hierarchy. So in talking about all of these terms, I want us to be clear about what protest is. I want everyone to understand that protest is a constitutionally valid behavior, and I want us to appreciate what protest is up against with regard to white supremacy. Now, how's all this related to voting in Georgia and Atlanta? Georgia and Atlanta, today and historically, are arguably ground zero for voter suppression. So voting in the city of Atlanta, in the state of Georgia, is an act of protest just to begin with. Atlanta is historically and currently a segregated city, and the power structure here has spent a lot of its historical time aimed at maintaining the white supremacist hierarchy. And this is regardless of the fact that the city's population is 30% Black. The state acts similarly, despite the fact that 30% of the state's population is Black. Let me give you some examples. On June 9th, our city's primary elections were a clear example of what we do not want elections to look like. The machines were broken, the polls opened late, there were too few poll workers, they were not as well trained as they needed to be. In majority Black communities, people waited anywhere from 4 to 7 hours to vote. The state blamed this situation on the counties and refused to take responsibility for what could arguably have been intended by the state. In 2018, our now governor, then Secretary of State, ran his own election for governor against Stacey Abrams and applied a number of voter suppression tactics that resulted in a narrow win for Governor Kemp. And there are strong arguments to be made that he stole that election. Our state's first 3 constitutions in 1777, 1787, and 1867 all denied Black people the right to vote. And after Reconstruction, we became a leader at passing Jim Crow laws that denied Black people the right to vote. So we were one of the first states to pass a poll tax. We followed up with a grandfather clause, literacy test, and we routinely allowed vigilante violence against Black people. From 1917 until 1962, the state of Georgia used what's called the county unit system, which granted more power to white rural communities than it did to majority Black counties or to majority Black urban areas. So that means that people are unable to have fairness with regard to voting individually and at the state level. In the early 2000s, the state of Georgia took a leadership role again and passed one of the first strict voter ID laws. The city's history of segregation has resulted in limited Black economic opportunity, limited access to public services, and it is the cause for our serious traffic problems that you'll see if you come here and visit our city, right? This is the traffic of segregation. Voting, therefore, is an act of protest in the state. And I would argue that protest is needed now in Atlanta and in the state of Georgia generally to move forward on the issues that we have today with police brutality. So my point here is that protest and voter participation occur on a continuum, and that the kinds of policies that we're hearing discussed about defunding the police, adding funding to public services, and organizers who are organizing in today's movement will potentially become representatives for Black people in Atlanta and other cities in the future. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Celeste Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited and honored to be a part of this very important conversation. Today, I would like to address or begin by addressing the relationship between social protests and processes of racialization. The definitional distinctions that Dr. Jones makes between protest versus riot, property damage versus violence, provide an important framework for unpacking the ways in which social movements and the language that we use to describe said movements have become racialized in ways that reinforce white supremacy. To say that social movements have become racialized suggests that the terms like riot and violence are attached to racial meanings. More often than not, Black protesters are perceived as violent rioters or looters even, while white protesters are perceived as demonstrators and American patriots. Likewise, who has the right to protest in this country is racialized. When we hear terms like violence or riot, we immediately have a racial understanding of who the perpetrators are, and it's primarily imagined to be Black and brown people. These racial understandings or ideas about how race works in the realm of social protests reflect broader racist ideologies that criminalize Blackness. We've seen this process of racialization and ultimately racism play out in both the national and local contexts. Even in Atlanta, a city dubbed as Wakanda or the Black Mecca due to its highly visible Black middle class and nearly 50 years of Black mayoral leadership, a police department that is approximately 60% Black, and one of the fastest growing markets for Black-owned businesses. Even here, race shapes the politics of who has the right to protest and challenge the status quo. Protests surrounding the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery began in Atlanta on May 29, 2020. A brief content analysis of 20 articles from news sources like CNN, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the New York Times reveal that the protests were described as chaotic, violent, or even riots. While many sources acknowledge that the bulk of the protests had been peaceful and nonviolent, headlines like "Tension Escalates into Violence in Fiery Atlanta Rally" or "Violent George Floyd Protest at CNN Center in Atlanta" became the dominant narrative of the Atlanta protests. Conversely, in Michigan, when armed militias stormed the state capitol building, these protesters were described as demonstrators or freedom fighters. Dubbed the American Patriot Rally by protest organizers, news headlines noted that some protesters also carried Confederate flags and swastikas. The content analysis revealed that Michigan protesters were described as resistors and even in some instances rebels, but nowhere were these protesters described as violent or riotous, despite being heavily armed with deadly weapons or unmasked during an airborne pandemic and adorned with symbols of racial terrorism like the Confederate flag and swastika. The comparisons between Michigan and Atlanta are not perfect, namely because the Atlanta protests did include vandalism and property damage. But the images from the two protests alone must force us to challenge our collective use of terms like violence to describe protests that involve property damage, but not in our description of social protests in which protesters are armed with assault rifles. Furthermore, the assumptions about who served as the instigators of riots and violence in Atlanta reflected dominant ideology that criminalizes Black bodies. A late night press conference called by Mayor Bottoms quickly revealed that protesters would bear the blame for the vandalism and property damage associated with the day's protests. In condemnation of the riots, Mayor Bottoms asserted her position as a Black mother to urge Atlantans to go home. Invoking her racial identification in this space made it clear that she was giving the directive to Black folks. The intended audience was further crystallized as Black Atlanta rappers Killer Mike and T.I. reinforced Mayor Bottoms' message by calling on demonstrators to not burn or destroy Wakanda. But as I watched and recorded several segments of the news that night and in the days that followed, it became apparent that the message to Black demonstrators may have been misdirected. From my observations, it was white presenting protesters leading the charge with violence and vandalism. The person suspected of throwing the first knives at the police was white presenting. The first person to attack the CNN building appeared to be a white male. The two people dubbed as turning protests violent at the governor's mansion over the weekend were white presenting. This is not to say that Black and brown people were not engaged in behaviors that were dubbed violent or riotous, but rather to acknowledge that white people appeared to play a central role. My observations were later confirmed in the media as headlines claim that Black protesters who want to demonstrate peacefully are calling out white people who instigate violence. So why is this important? It's important to explore these broader racial dynamics within these contemporary social protests because one, we often use this type of language to demonize Black-centered protests in a way that just doesn't happen for white-centered protests. Doing so, as Dr. Jones referenced, provides a license for excessive force and state-sanctioned violence to be the response to Black protests. This is true even when government agents and leadership identify as Black. For example, in Atlanta, the National Guard was deployed to respond to the vandalism and property damage despite no physical threat to citizens' lives. The presence, likewise, or secondly, the presence of white agitators in social movements for equality is not new. It has historically been a tactical strategy wielded by federal and local government, from COINTELPRO to the presence of undercover officers in the protest in Ferguson. We have seen this strategy used to disrupt, distract from, or to frame the movement as violent and dangerous, all for the purpose of ultimately discrediting the movement. Lastly, it would be irresponsible to suggest that all white vandals and rioters had nefarious motives of sabotaging the protests. Contemporary protests are characterized as much more racially and ethnically diverse than protests connected to the historic civil rights movement. This heterogeneity is a positive. Social movement scholars note that in order for protests to become successful social movements, they must be able to draw in support from allies who benefit from the very systems that we challenge. Nonetheless, the increase in diversity among protesters may be more complicated and nuanced than we've currently explored. We have to give real time and space to not only what it means to be an ally, how to be an ally. It's plausible that white vandals were well-meaning allies that showed up ready to perform their own ideas of protest. But we must recognize that Black people's very existence is protest. Thus, our riot is against Black genocide. This type of riot must center the leadership, desires, and voices of Black people. And white allyship must draw upon displays of support that feel supported to Black people. So I've spent the majority of my time ultimately highlighting how racism, via processes of racialization, impact our understanding of who has the right to protest, riot, and violence. As a fellow Atlanta native, I would like to conclude by providing some context for why Blacks and whites alike would and should protest and riot in Atlanta. On a national level, Atlanta has the reputation of being a racially progressive Southern city, and more specifically, a safe haven for Black people, both socially and economically. On the night of May 29th, rapper T.I. took to the mic and said, "This city don't deserve this. However, I understand that a lot of others do, but we can't do this here," he said. "This is Wakanda. This is sacred. It's supposed to be protected." For those like T.I. who question why Black people would burn down Wakanda or whether Atlanta deserves this, the Atlanta police have killed unarmed people here too, with little to no accountability. Because of this, we must protest for justice and to affirm that Black lives matter, that the lives of Jimmy Atchison, Katherine Johnston, Jamaria Robinson, DeAndre Phillips, Oscar Kane, Jarvis Lyles, and most recently, Rayshard Brooks, that their lives do indeed matter. In addition to issues of police violence, Atlanta's imagery of a Black Mecca or as a Black Mecca is marred by gross inequities. For example, in 2017, the city's jobless rate for Black residents was 11.5% and only 2.5% for white residents. I share this to say that Black people experience systematic inequality here like anywhere else. Black political leadership and a hyper-visual Black upper middle class offer symbolic recognitions of Black people's humanity in Atlanta, but they do not make the city impervious to the reality of institutionalized racism and white supremacy that is embedded in America's DNA. Considered by many the epicenter of the historic civil rights movement, Atlanta has long stood center stage in racial justice protests. From the Summer Hill riots of 1966 to the highway shutdowns and riots of 2016, Atlanta's citizens have a deep history of challenging state-sanctioned violence and police brutality in our communities. Martin Luther King Jr. argued that riots are the language of the unheard. We will continue to riot in Atlanta until our cries for equality are heard. We must protest until Atlanta can fully live up to its reputation as a racially progressive Southern city. I thank you for your ear. At this time, I will turn it over to our Atlanta student activist, Sophia Howard.
So I'm going to pivot the conversation just a little bit and kind of address the question of who claims to speak for and represent the protesters and whose voices are elevated and heard. When we think about protest and resistance movements, it's incredibly important to think about who we view as the leaders. Who do we see at the forefront of these said movements? Are the people whose voices that are being elevated correctly representing the people who are calling for freedom? Or are they the ones whose voices and bodies are most palatable for a movement still operating within systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism? When doing work to eradicate or to suspend these systems, it's important to remember and acknowledge that we all still exist within them, that our language and socialization are still tools of white supremacy, of patriarchy, and of capitalism. We have to think about the so-called aesthetics of activism. And when we're not critical about why police brutality centers Black men and is prioritized over others, and why the narratives and voices of other cisgender heterosexual men are centered as being the leaders of these movements, we do a disservice to the movement. And that's saying, that goes for the city of Atlanta and then also looking nationally. When we're not critical about these themes, we're actually aiding white supremacy and patriarchy, because without having a comprehensive, inclusive framework to work on and surrounding the people that are most marginalized and centering those narratives, the movement can't progress. And I believe that a movement can only be as radical as those whose voices and bodies are centered over and over again while doing the work. At my short time at the Equal Justice Initiative, I learned that movements are created through narratives. There are few better examples of a more poignant narrative story than that of Rosa Parks' arrest in the front of that bus on the evening of December 1st, 1955. And being critical about Mrs. Parks' narrative, we examined the truth behind that dark Alabama evening. She was on that bus by no chance. She sat in the front of the bus by no single act of resistance. She was the woman chosen to spark what would become the Montgomery bus boycott that would later desegregate the buses. A modest-dressed, married, light-skinned seamstress who was active in her church was the person chosen to ignite the movement, not Claudette Coven, the dark-skinned teenager who was later pregnant. Rosa Parks was no coincidence. The civil rights leaders at that point knew that the story of Rosa Parks would initiate empathy and elicit outrage. And as Atlanta has served as a city of protest and resistance, as previously mentioned, the stories and the narratives of the people that have been centered are not very different. And as we continue to look back in history and examine the successes and failures of those past movements, it's important that we address and constantly combat those systems of oppression that render some more visible than others. Angela Davis was once asked why she was the face of the Black Panther Party movement. And when other women like Afeni Shakur and Paula Hill were constantly silenced, and she immediately attributed that to colorism. While on a panel with Patrisse Cullors, Ms. Cullors said that it was nothing other than misogynoir that was to blame for some folks' inability to believe that 3 queer Black women had founded the Black Lives Matter movement. And since its founding, there's been a steady erasure of their narratives when they should be the continuously centered narratives as queer Black women. We have to think about ableism and the ways in which differently abled folks can participate in the movement. And we have to acknowledge that even when efforts have not been made to center them or to acknowledge their work, they've shown up. We have to discuss the erasure of queerness in these movements. Malcolm X was bisexual and James Baldwin was gay, and those are important parts of their narratives. We have to acknowledge that the movements of the past and the movements of today, and particularly in the city of Atlanta, where so many of its citizens are Black, have always had the most marginalized show up and participate. And not only that, but they're the center and the heartbeat of these movements. A movement should always be led with its heart, and therefore the most marginalized should always be centered. Their stories and narratives are important, and we have to lead from a position of radical acceptance and demand equity and freedom the same way that we do in society, the same way that we do in these movements. Atlanta historically has been a site of resistance, from being burned to the ground and rebuilt to being an important location for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. To now, where my peers are holding space for Rayshard Brooks and holding space for those whose names and narratives are not deemed strategically important. Atlanta cannot be the Black Mecca. It cannot be Wakanda if the narratives of the silenced are not brought out of the dark. It's when we center the Shaun Whites instead of the Rachel Cargills, or the DeRay McKinsons instead of the Erica Harts, that we disappoint yet another generation of revolutionaries. And centering those voices, we aren't working to loosen the grips of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. We are instead strengthening its hold on the oppressed and subjugated. The narratives of the movement, if we water down the narratives of a movement, we water down the movement itself. Thank you. And then I'll pass it on to our last colleague, Mary Pat Hector, who will wrap us up.
Yes, thank you all so much for your comments, and also thank you to the ICW. Today, I'll discuss how our movement differs today from the civil rights movement in the 60s. Briefly, Simone talked about intersectionality, and so we'll discuss how intersectionality has impacted our movement in the past versus today, and how there's no one central leader or organizational voice now in what we see as the resurgence of the civil rights movement. And I'll briefly talk about my experiences organizing in both Kentucky and Atlanta. So currently, intersectionality is playing a role in the modern civil rights movement. And historically, within our movements, our agenda has been Black, hetero, male-centered. Young people today are saying that Black lives can't matter unless we say that they all matter. During the 1960s civil rights movement, there were women that led the civil rights movement, names that we have never heard of until today. Names like Daisy Bates, who was a leader in the movement to end segregation in Arkansas. And Daisy Bates was a guide for the 9 students who integrated Little Rock Central High School in 1958. Ella Baker. Everyone knows how integral Dr. Martin Luther King was, and the fact that he was the face of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was also seen as one of the most prominent African-American civil rights leaders of our time. But if it wasn't for the political savvy and long life activist Ella Baker, we would not have the the SCLC, and Dr. Martin Luther King would not have had that platform. Or even Amelia Boynton, who championed voting rights for African Americans. Many don't know her story, or the fact that she was brutally beaten for helping lead the 1965 Civil Rights March that we know now as Bloody Sunday. Amelia Boynton was also the first Black woman to run for Congress in the state of Alabama. Aside from just being Black women and often ignored, there was another community that was often ignored or overlooked during the Civil Rights Movement, and that community was the LGBTQIA community. Bayard Rustin was not only one of the closest advisors to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but he single-handedly organized the 1963 March on Washington and did not receive a platform or a voice within that movement because he was a gay Black man. Pauli Murray was an activist whose struggle for racial and gender equality took place years within education before Brown versus the Board of Education. We don't know her story because she was an openly gay Black woman. Again, in prior movements, the Black agenda has been extremely monolithic. However, we see now that this is different. Now, when you go out to these protests, you see Black women leading these movements. Simone briefly talked about Patrisse Cullors and the Black queer women that founded Black Lives Matter. Black women are saying you cannot have a Black agenda without highlighting the issues of Black women. The modern agenda also clearly says that we can't forget about Black trans women and men who were killed at the hands of police as well. I also talked about how this differs from previous movements, seeing how we don't have a central voice or organization. During the 1960s movement, there was CORE, the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party. When it comes to leaders, there was something called the Big Six. And if you never heard of the Big Six, that's John Lewis, Whitney Young, Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, James Farmer, and Roy Wilkins, as well as Malcolm X. Now, young people are saying we don't need to be a part of an organization to make a difference. As long as we're out here collectively and we're working and bringing awareness to these issues, then we can truly make a difference. Young people are often now more so turned off from structural leadership. They feel that all of this structural leadership or just focusing on one organization has actually caused a lot of harm to our movement in the past. And I thought that was very, very interesting. Dr. Lee highlighted allies. During these movements now, you're seeing more and more white allies, and also brands and corporations saying Black Lives Matter and funding millions and millions of dollars into this movement. Organizations like Amazon, Walmart, and the National Football League, who just months prior to our protest really upheld white supremacy within their organizations, and many would argue still do today. Coretta Scott King once said, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You win it and earn it in every generation." And young people in communities like Louisville, Kentucky, the city of Atlanta, Minneapolis, and others are upholding that. And they are fighting for their freedom every single day. And they're also saying, we're not going to forget about Black women. We're not going to forget about trans people within our community who are dying at the hands of police. I want to thank you all so much for being with us today. We're going to go into a 2-minute break, and we're asking for you to drop your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank the Atlanta team for their powerful presentations. Thank the audience for submitting your questions. Please continue to do so. Again, this is a great moment to stretch, to keep hydrated. And on the other side of this question and answer session, we'll hear from the engaged scholars and community leaders and students from Washington, D.C. So Dr. Jones reminds us that protests and voting lie on a continuum. She provides a series of clarifying definitions around terms like protest, riot, property damage, and encourages us to be suspicious of their deployment. She also considers the resilience of white supremacy and that things that we might take for granted, like voting, are in Georgia and in many parts of this country, their own types of protests, given the rampant nature of Black voter suppression. Then, even though today's protesters are much more diverse than those in previous generations, Dr. Lee considers the racialization of protest and specifically how these narratives are created and circulated in the media. Whites are constantly figured as patriotic resistors, where unarmed Blacks are nearly always assumed to be violent and or riotous. She further asks, what does it mean to value property over people? And makes the point that even living in a place like Atlanta, which is broadly known as the Black Mecca, that is also a city that is not a refuge from institutionalized racism. Sophia Howard asks, who are the leaders of these movements and what are the dangers of centering cisgender men? Then she recalls the story of the promotion and creation of Rosa Parks as a particular type of respectable protest figure. How can this movement lead from the position, and the term Howard uses is of radical acceptance, to ensure that the marginalized remain at the center? And then finally, Mary Pat Hector rounded out your presentations, again, returning to this historical lens, highlighting the leadership of Black women and queer activists, and reminding us not to produce this earlier silencing. She points to the power of decentralized organizing and points to what it means to live in a society where each generation needs to keep fighting for their freedom. So the first question that I want to share from our audience, it piggybacks well. It's actually is in some ways sort of framed around a story that's come out of Minneapolis, but it really intersects, I think, with many of your presentations. So the audience member asks, it came out today that the first person to instigate violence in Minneapolis was a white supremacist caught on camera. I am concerned that there will be more violence around the election. What can white allies what and how can white allies prepare to assist and protect voters and protesters as we move forward, and also to protect against communities of color against the police?
So one thing that I would say is right now there's a big push in Georgia to get people to commit to becoming both poll workers and poll election protection monitors. I think that this is a great step that all allies can take, as well as young people at all of the colleges and universities in the state of Georgia, to protect the right to vote of Georgians.
And this is not just true about protecting voters physically. We need to avoid fraudulent treatment of the election during the election, right? We're being accused of voter fraud, which doesn't happen. But we do need to make sure that the election is administered properly and safely and results in accurate results.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly piggyback off of what Mary Pat said as well. I think that Portland is currently a good model for what allyship in action can look like, right? For being, if you're white and you're an ally or you identify as an ally, your body is actually very powerful, right? And so like being like a poll monitor, doing things like that, putting yourself physically in spaces to protect Black and brown bodies is very powerful. And so I would definitely use that shield of privilege, understanding that you're far less likely to be brutalized or a victim of violence from the police state than any Black or brown person.
I would just like to add that Mary Pat's presentation highlighted how these movements are decentralized, but it's also true that these protests have organizers. And so anyone seeking to be an ally should begin by addressing organizers. What can I do to support? I think the best way to be an ally is to come from a position where you are willing to listen and sacrifice in ways that those centered in the movement are saying are most helpful. So in addition to physically being a presence, also having the mentality of service in which you're able to listen to how best to serve a particular community or group from those who sit in those positions of organizing.
Thank you so much. Another question from our audience. I was wondering how we can continue to do this work in the education system as early as the elementary school. And the question continues, how do we get people to listen, especially when racism is something that is learned in the home? And how do we prevent this mentality from progressing?
I would like to start if my colleagues from Atlanta are okay with that. So as a sociologist, and particularly as a person that studies race, I talk about racism and what it is all the time. And I think that from our kind of lay of understandings, we oftentimes think about racism as an attitude. And what I challenge people to do is to think about racism as a system, as a structure in which, as Dr. Jones talked about in her presentation, we see that certain groups are ranked in society relative to others, whether or not we're looking at income data or we're looking at residential segregation or gentrification. We can see a hierarchy in the data of who has health insurance, who's most likely to be unemployed. There's a ranking where we see that by and large, white groups are at the top and groups of color, particularly Blacks and Latinos, hang at the bottom. And so that structure in and of itself is racist. And we affirm that structure by these ideas and narratives that we tell about racism. What about Black on Black crime? When inherently crime is an intra-racial experience. People harm people that they live close to. So there's no such thing as Black on Black crime, but that's the story that we tell. And so when we think about how do we stop this? How do we address racism? I love the question about what do we do in terms of education? One of the ways in which that structure that I explained is reinforced is through the curriculum in schools. Both on a local and national level, we've seen textbooks taken to task for the ways in which they characterize slavery as Black immigrants, or that life on the plantation was happy. And granted, if we're talking about the institution of slavery in a first grade classroom, of course, there's a certain level of tact that we would have, but surely we wouldn't want to teach even a 5-year-old that slavery was about Black immigrants. And so I share that to say that how do we address this? One, we want to be real and think about the ways in which racism is far more than not liking another group because of their race. It's about the laws that disproportionately affect groups of color. It's about the residential patterns that both Minneapolis talked about and Dr. Jones talked about. And so when you think about how do we address this problem, beyond changing hearts and minds, we have to change laws, we have to change practices that reinforce the differentiation or this hierarchy of different racial groups.
I also think that the education system, just not the curriculum, but also talking about the system, right? And everything from, looking at public schools, looking at white flight schools, examining the ways in which communities have bussed white students out of certain schools and spaces, and other schools have been created, and defunding. And also, in this season of Corona, being very careful and monitoring the way that education is changed currently, and I think that you have to I think the question is a very big question, but I think that lots of people don't actually know how the education system works, and that it's a political system, and that, you know, these schools and whatnot are making money and all of these types of things. So we have to be very critical when we're thinking, oh, well, you know, I'm sending my kid to this school and they're, you know, every one of their classmates except for 3 of them are white, right? So it has to be a thing that each family addresses. I'm choosing to send my white child to a school where everybody looks like them, right? So I think that that's also something we have to continue to investigate and interrogate.
I'd just like to add that essentially based upon what the Minneapolis team was talking about passing on information, right? Passing information from this group of youth movement to the next and to the next. I think we need to pay some attention to that, because some of our learning might not come from our elementary school education in our formal school, but if we can get people to be in discussion outside of institutions. You know, I'm talking about moving protest agenda to elections, and that's fantastic, but that can't stand alone, right? Here we are back in 2020 having social movement against police brutality when we've already changed the law. So I mean, it's a consistent cultural training that I think has to happen outside of some of our major institutions and outside of what we expect from our laws.
Thank you so much to our Atlanta team for really wonderful presentations. I want to thank Dr. Jones. I want to thank Dr. Lee. I want to thank Ms. Howard, and I also want to thank Ms. Hector. And now I am going to begin to introduce our Washington, DC collaborative. Last but definitely not least, I want to also remind you that we are again collecting your questions on Zoom and on YouTube throughout their presentation. We're also asking you to we'll also be collecting your questions on Zoom and on YouTube throughout their presentation. Please also send in your questions. The chat will remain open. And I'm honored to introduce you to the DC Collaborative. They are Dr. Bahia Muhammad, Mr. Tony Lewis, Ms. Anaya Vines, and Dr. Brittany Gatewood. Dr. Muhammad is Associate Professor of Criminology in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Howard University. Dr. Muhammad's ethnographic research focuses on the criminal justice system and on the experiences of children of incarcerated parents, both in the United States as well as around the world. She is the director of an innovative prison education program at Howard University, the Dr. Muhammad Experience, which takes university students into the prison system to learn alongside incarcerated people. Tony Lewis is a change agent, an author, an activist, a re-entry expert, and champion for children with incarcerated parents. Mr. Lewis has fought relentlessly for the past 2 decades to empower men, women, and children impacted by mass incarceration. His re-entry work has been vital to building bridges between employers and formerly incarcerated people, and his social advocacy work and mentoring of DC youth have made him an honored and recognized community leader, both locally and nationally. Ms. Anaya Vines is a junior at Howard University. She has engaged in various levels of community and social justice organizing, from creating mentoring programs and organizing gun violence walkouts to her work as the NAACP Education Committee Chairwoman for the Howard University chapter. And she also has built a nonprofit organization, TRAP, True Rehabilitation and Prosperity, which focuses on creating and delivering strategic programming for youth who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Brittany Gates, who holds a postdoctoral position at Albany State University and is an adjunct at George Washington University and also Prince George's Community College. Dr. Gatewood identifies as a Black queer woman scholar activist. Her research focuses on social movements within carceral institutions and the political practices and resistance of Black women and children. Thank you so much, Washington, D.C., and I'm happy to turn this over to Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Today has been an excellent teach-in where we have been gathered since this afternoon, really learning about the inner workings of social protests and social change, looking at it from a racial perspective. Today, the DC group is going to include myself kind of laying a foundation around the ways in which youth engage in protests. When we think about racial justice protests and we think about social change, I want individuals to just step back, take in the information that we've already had, which has reiterated and constantly talked about the role of the younger individuals in this particular movement. What you see in front of you now are Howard University students from all across the nation, as well as from across the African diaspora. This includes our students who are as young as 18 years old and as old as 21, leading in the movement. And right now they are calling it a tipping point. We are now at the tipping point where history is being made. We have students that are now coming in during pandemic, as well as during social injustice unrest. And their eyes are open, their ears are open, they are in tune with the movement, they are reading, they are preparing themselves, and they are unapologetically Black, brown, and centered. It is very important that you understand this as a public service announcement to make sure that you too are aware of those young intellectuals that are among you. When we think about the movement, oftentimes we stampede across the lives and the voices, and most importantly, the questions of those younger individuals amongst us. When you look at these pictures, you see a strong Black young sister holding a sign to her back because she would rather show it from the back than to be seen from the face. Not every individual who is a child that is amongst the movement will be a leader or an individual that you will recognize by face, or an image that goes viral on social media. Oftentimes, these are young individuals in our community that don't get the breath of fresh air to easily have a question answered or even have an opportunity to gain the social capital and courage to ask, what is racism? What does it mean to be a young Black child? What does it mean to see violent and vicious death at the hands of those individuals that are to protect us? It is very important that we listen to the voices that the children are sharing with us, but also their movements and their actions. I want to draw your attention to the young sister holding her earrings, where she's holding up a young Black woman on her earrings with an afro. And oftentimes we find that individuals want to touch the hair of Black youth. They want to prattle them and engage them in dialect and conversation that only allows them to learn something about their culture, which doesn't give anything to them. They are not specimens. They are not voices or individuals that should be reckoned with. They are powerful, and they are the strength of our next generation. You see the final picture in these three suites of the individual that is holding the sign for Black Lives Matter. And as you see, there's a strong sense of pride on her face. She is happy and excited to be hopeful in the midst of the movement. And in order to pass the baton on to the next generation, we must allow them to have hope, but we also must make sure that they are educated in that hopeful plight as well. When we think about young Black boys, oftentimes they are muzzled and they are silenced. And I thought that this was a very powerful picture that was posted in the Atlantic, looking specifically at children as protesters and ways of engaging in dialogue with them, where we are not watering down anything, but really allowing for the opportunity for their voices to be heard and for us to advance their movement. In the midst of COVID-19, we find that we have to cover our mouths. We also have to cover our mouths. And so oftentimes we don't know what the feelings of these young individuals are, but you can see the strength, not only in his arm that is hung up high, but also in the hope in his eyes as he looks up at adults and individuals that will spearhead what his next steps will be. The young sisters, the two that are with one another, have each other, but oftentimes you find that children find themselves in the midst of this movement alone. And it is our duty to assure their safety and their productivity, not only in this movement, but also in the long haul. And again, that means that we must listen to them. And oftentimes it's what they're not saying that is the most powerful component of the messages that they are sending. When we think about Black children, we must also not forget about our white allies and their children. It is very important that we engage in dialogue around anti-racism, white supremacy, and that we engage in these conversations with the young individuals among us. And oftentimes we have individuals that ask students in the movement of the protest, as white allies, what should we be doing? You should be educating your children and being brutally honest about the realities of where we are today and not erasing yourself. Oftentimes the children are in the cars when we are driving by and may frown our face at individuals that are a different color than us, when we may clutch our pearls or we may clutch our bags because of the individuals that have been deemed violent and non-human. Our children see those things. And so the first step is to make sure that you are practicing what it is that you preach. And all of these young children are very important in the movement. This message here is just to highlight the importance of passing on the dialogue and making sure that the next generation is not forgotten and unheard. When we think about social movements, oftentimes individuals as young as 6 years old were protesting in Birmingham, Alabama. And don't forget the reality that the reason why they were on the front lines was because if their parents were caught, their homes would be burnt down. Their vehicles would be taken away from them. They would lose their jobs in their day-to-day. And so there were no rights of them to be able to protest. And so when we think about this on a continuum, it is very important that we educate our children on the importance, but also the political statement that is being made when you are a Black child holding up a sign that says Black Lives Matter when the world is fighting to recognize for all lives to matter. I start in my own family with my own children. I educate them on the movement. These are pictures of myself and my children as I educate them through a homeschool curriculum, utilizing books for children that talk about racism, that give an opportunity to not water down, but have a critical dialogue that allows children to ask the questions that need to be answered. Remember, all of the individuals that we know as the superheroes of the social justice movements across the nation have been very young individuals that grew into amazing adults. Thank you. I would like to introduce Mr. Tony Lewis Jr. to give us what it's like to be on the grounds in DC as a native Washingtonian, as a scholar, as an instructor, and as a social activist.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Greetings, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. So I want to start with talking about a movement that we deem the DC Native movement. In 2018, the Washingtonian magazine, which is a preeminent lifestyle magazine here in the District of Columbia, they launched a campaign about with a t-shirt campaign on Instagram that said, "I'm not a tourist, I live here." And every model in the campaign was white in a city that's 47% Black and historically has been deemed Chocolate City. So myself and my co-organizer, Angel Gregario, organized a counter photo shoot. We saw this photo shoot as an opportunity for us to stand on our principles, not only as Native Washingtonians, but as Black people in this city who were tired of being overlooked and underappreciated. Even in a city that had Black leadership, we felt like Black Washingtonians, people born here, were being left behind. We live in a city where, again, we had the highest gentrification in the city. I'm sorry, in the country. And at that time, you know, Black Washingtonians represented a large amount of us were, you know, living below the poverty line. Obviously, we had some of the highest incarceration rates, some of the highest murder rates in the country. And so with that, this was an opportunity for us to resist and really to shine a light on DC and say DC was continuing to sort of manifest white supremacy, even in a sense where people don't know it. Institutional racism was alive and well here in the District of Columbia. And young people that didn't normally come out to vote, people didn't normally come out to protest. And the sight of all of these amazing Black people, young people together, it really sent a jolt into our city council. It sent a jolt into our mayoral office, our executive office, to say that there had to be immediate policy and legislation that would speak to improving the lives of the people that you see in these pictures and their families. And so we've seen millions of dollars poured into affordable housing. We've seen programs around employment and training expanded. We've seen outreach to specific challenged communities. We've seen a lot of money go into youth programs. We've seen the business community step up and say that they wanted to do more for the population to try to slow this erasure and displacement of Black Washingtonians. We also another movement that was, you know, a part of starting was the Don't Mute DC movement that really spoke to exactly the same thing. Go-go in DC is what jazz is to New Orleans, what reggae is to Jamaica, what hip hop is to New York City. And so it's our heartbeat in this city, in a store that had been in a gentrified community for 20 years, and now the new residents were calling for them to cut off the go-go music. And that was sort of a furthering of this idea that DC natives were trying, you know, were being erased, were being forced out of our city. And that sort of put the movement into a whole entire other gear, if you will. It brought out thousands of people that came and organized and rallied. And the beautiful part about the Don't Mute DC movement happened right around budget time. So we were able to save the only hospital that's in Ward 7 and 8, which is a historically Black area of our city, predominantly Black area of our city. We were able to get money saved around violence reduction, violence interruption, job training. So what that taught us was that if we're able to mobilize our folks and we can make these statements of resistance, if we can also have policy and legislation plans when we are rallying. So none of this was just about us showing up. We had an agenda, we had demands, and all of our demands haven't yet to be reached, but we're working on it. And we know the momentum and the energy from these two subsequent movements have really changed or moved the dial here in the District of Columbia as it relates to social justice and racial equity in our city. White people outlive Black people in DC by 15 years. The income gap between Black and white residents is around $90,000, right? And so we have a lot of work to do. But these two movements, the DC Native movement and the Don't Mute DC, the Don't Mute DC movement, created by young people, led by young people, mobilized by young people, has definitely made opportunities here in DC expand, and we've put all of our issues on the radar. And I think with BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, right now where we are, I think DC was ready and prompt and able to continue to push forward for racial equity and justice, and we will continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony Lewis Jr. for that and for your active engagement. We're now going to be moving to our undergraduate student, Anaya Vines, who is going to share with us all of the amazing work that she's been doing and continues to do.
Hi, everyone. I just first want to thank ICW for giving me the opportunity to speak on this teaching. I really do appreciate it. So empowering the youth, the importance of the youth, especially in this climatic time that we're in. My family lives by the saying, make sure the next generation is better than the last generation. Make sure you prepare the next people that come after you better than how you lived during your time. So I grew up with the mentality, what do I do? What do I need to do to make sure my kids, my future kids are taken care of, making sure that generationally my family is well off, better than how I am. And now that I'm 20 years old, I see that I have to make sure I'm taking care of more than just my blood family. So the people that look like me, my brothers and sisters, I realize that the systemic oppression in our country affects anyone that looks like me, my Black and Brown community. So making sure that we are all taken care of and helping to liberate my kin by saying, okay, how does my Black girl magic work? What is my Black girl magic? And I always love to refer back to the conference that Dr. Muhammad had that centered around, Black girl magic, and me realizing my Black girl magic is to unite. My Black girl magic is to organize on a large scale, to build. So I wanted to make sure that that was tapped into and spread for this next generation. So after the passing of Congressman John Lewis and the civil rights activist C.T. Vivian, it made it extremely evident to me that our generation is up next. We are up next. We have to make sure that we are effectively prepared. Why is it so important? Why is it so vital that we understand that this generation is getting past that baton? Because we're custom made to recognize the beast that fits in our generation, in our society. We already know that systemic oppression has been a continuous thing in the past years, but it always changes its mask. So it fits for the people that it's supposed to be oppressing at that time. I feel like it is important for this generation to be educated on what that systemic oppression looks like in every way, because that's going to be camouflaged in more ways than one, whether it is mass incarceration, whether it is in the education system, and the new Jim Crow. We know what that looks like because we're bred in this generation, that 21st century. So making sure that that is taken care of. We have this important combination. The youth has this energy, and I like to use the equation thirst plus energy plus passion equals power. So that's what the youth embody by just being young. So I feel as though our youthfulness is our power. So we can't wait until we get older and say, okay, now that, I'm of age, quote unquote, now I can make change. No, make the change now. See what the need is and be that need. Fill in that gap that you feel like needs to be filled. Find that way in which you can make change within your community. And I'll talk about it later, but whether that means you have to go somewhere and travel, go ahead and do that. Whether you need to meet up with different organizations and reach out, whether it means to invest into different organizations, you do that. Whether it's creating your own organization, if you feel like that there is an organization that really reflects what the need is, you create that. I feel like the age of what you are is not a limitation. I feel like that's an advantage that you have, because you have so many years ahead of you to not only create, but also to learn. There's been so many people who have paved the way for us. So we take on and we pay homage to those who have come before us by taking on those lessons that they learned, taking on the things that they have passed down to us, generational lessons, and applying it to what we are trying to build for that next generation. So in 2018, that's when I started my activism. So I was about 17, 18 years old in high school. And that was during the gun violence awareness crisis, when there was just like a back-to-back shootings in different schools, like around the nation. And so I created a club at my school called VOICE, standing for Vision, Outspoken, Inspired, Create, and Evolve. And so we led a gun violence awareness march walkout that had about 300 students come out. So it was wonderful, and it was my first ever activist event. So it was wonderful, and it made me realize that I don't have to wait. I am so effective now as a student, as a high school student, as that. I want to make sure my brothers and sisters know how effective you can be. You don't have to wait at all. So throughout my school career, I also realized that there's a lot of work that goes into both activism, but also goes into education. There's a fine balance that has to be found when you take on this responsibility of being an activist and putting your work in. If you're also in school, there's a responsibility that you have to make sure that that is executed just as well. So Howard, of course, we know that it is one of the top HBCUs recognized, but it's not hard to get into that school. So I had to make sure that graduating, that my GPA was taken care of. I had to make sure that I had all my ducks in a row. My weighted GPA was about 4.2. I made sure that my SATs was above 1200. I made sure that I knew what I had to do in the community, but also I knew what I had to do with the textbooks. So I also led a Juneteenth march in Atlanta that resulted in a couple thousand people as well. And I realized, okay, now this is something that is going to blow up. This is something that has to be lived on. And I created the Live movement. So it's a combination and unification of HBCUs and NAACP chapters to really come together as one. And we're living for those who have died. So it's centered around the youth coming to the forefront of everything that's going on and saying, okay, we have to recognize that this is passed on to us. We must continue. So it's the embodiment of Black education and making sure that people know that HBCUs are just as valued as PWIs. HBCUs are just as valid as PWIs. The Black knowledge that we are taught on a day-to-day basis gives us an advantage, I feel personally, with anyone else, because we have a power that's taught to us and passed down to us. And now we have that responsibility to regurgitate that to our community and to other people that might not look like me. So there's an upcoming march that I'm planning right now in DC, March of the Generations. So now that I have a team together, I have different students of Howard working with me to create this HBCU March of the Generations. This is to show the community that this fight is continuous. It must have the youth and create a platform for the youth to speak their minds and to make effective change. And Mr. Tony Lewis, since I'm gonna be in DC, I'll be looking to be reaching out to you and connecting with you. I'm being your city and you're older, so you have learned things that I might not know. So you can provide guidance to me and my team that I might not have. So the Live movement is carrying on that baton, but also getting guidance from those who have been doing work for years, day in and day out. This is a movement for the youth to say, okay, the cameras are down, the hashtags have been slowing down, the streets have been cleared, it's time to put in the real work. Who is with me? And so that is also inclusive to people who don't look like me. So for instance, Mackenzie Scott just donated $40 million, $40 million, which is the most anyone has ever invested in Howard University in its 153 years of existence. So if you do not look like me, then find a way to support the Black and Brown community, especially with Black education. So that means investing. That means being out there with us on the front lines in the valleys, making sure that you're saying, what can I do? So even though you might not experience what we go through on a day-to-day basis, see where you can fit in, because it's more than just posting a Black screen. And make sure that whenever you have a way to be invested and be on our side, be on our side. You know, you might walk the walk, but you also have to remember to talk that talk. So you guys have already seen the flyer for that march. And if you want to follow _the Live movement for our future events coming up, please do so. And you can follow me as well at Smiling Emoji on Instagram. We also have a Twitter. But yes, I want to charge the next generation with the question, what do we do now? What do we do now? This is the most important thing that we need to understand and need to start that conversation, because once that is created, we know that we're moving as a unit. We are one, we are family, and we have to make sure that we empower one another going forward as the next generation. Thank you.
Wow, so powerful, Anaya Vines. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to move directly into our closer, Dr. Brittany Gatewood. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate this second time around, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. Take us away.
Well, thank you. And I also want to shout out the hair, you know, try to represent. But in my presentation, this is very much specifically geared towards, you know, students, youth, and also white allies, because both are important in this movement. And so these pictures that I'm showing here, and once all these pictures I've taken, because I've been going to protests for a very long time, but these pictures were actually from 2015, but they look very similar to the pictures today. So the reason I showed this in Minneapolis, other people have described, like this movement has been occurring for years. So this isn't just something that just happened, right? It just is with the killing of this new group of people that we put a lot of attention to, but this has been occurring for years. And this is not a new movement, it's just a new period of time. And with Dr. Rose, she was talking about because of the change in the social, political, and economic context of today, this is why things look a little bit different. But next. So I want to also show what's been going on in DC. And so these are pictures of what has actually been going on the ground in DC now. And so these, you see the Army, there's the National Guard and police throughout the city. And the second picture is where the Black Lives Matter street that people have seen pictures on is located. And on this day specifically, there were multiple protests happening that all ended up in the same area. And with the rest of the speakers, you know, these protests have been going on all over the nation. And you see in this picture, the White House is at the end. So you have thousands of people going to the White House to protest, you know, what's been going on. And also at the same time, you have blockades that are happening. So people can't get close to even, you know, public institution. They can't get, the National Guard was on, you have horses and SWAT teams so that you can't get close to a certain area, even though, you know, and we even seen that places were getting cleared out by tear gas, you know, even though we're using our First Amendment rights. So next. But I also want to talk about why people join movements. So one thing I do teach is social movements. And so I want to explain like a little bit why people join movements. So first reason is like something resonates with them. And especially with Black Lives Matter movement or the movement for Black Lives, a lot of people in the Black community have had experiences with the criminal justice system, with police brutality. So it is something that they are faced with often. And now it's just now getting to the mainstream, right? People are now taking a look at, oh, this is really happening, when it's been happening, you know, since the beginning of this country, this state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies. But another reason people join movements is because a system loses legitimacy. And so we become, our subjective attachment to something, the system that we have, it loses what its legitimacy and respect is. So now you see the criminal justice system, now you see police, they're losing some legitimacy in people's minds. And so people are joining movements because they're seeing there's gaps between what they thought our system is and what it's actually doing, and it also resonates with them. Either they experience it or they see someone else experience it. But I also want to have a warning on performative allyship. So this is people, and you all seen a couple weeks ago, that's posted, you know, Black square on social media, on Instagram, and talk about, oh, Black Lives Matter. But then a week later, you're, you know, saying the N-word, you're cussing someone out, you're doing all this other stuff. So people are joining these movements, but they're not really about that life, essentially, right? They, you know, it seems like something's cool to do, right? They, you know, they flip the script later, but it's something hip to do now. And you see these things, especially with companies, we're gonna do statements about Black lives. Where were you, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago? But now it's really cool. And now you don't want to seem racist. So now you're doing these things. And so joining movements, people sometimes have very, very legitimate reasons. Other reasons is they just don't want to seem like they're racist. And they even talked about earlier when, I think it was Atlanta, when you talk about when people are doing like this performative allyship and they are just now being aware of these things, like this hasn't been happening for a long time. And so it's something that when you're joining these movements, you know, and the white people, you know, starting the riots or starting violence against certain property damage and police, that is not Black people starting these things. And so people join movements for a variety of reasons. So whether it's legitimate or illegitimate reason. And so we need to be aware of the difference. Next. I also want to talk about how movements die. And so this is a picture that I took. I was there when they started essentially burning down DC. And so they were starting the fires. This is right, probably half a block away from the White House. So they were climbing posts, they were firebombing places. But the thing is, movements die because they might have, and you see it even now, there's less posts that you see, it's losing steam because usually a climactic thing happens, right? These cities are burning, all these kind of things, and then it kind of twiddles out. And so there's reasons why that happens. First is state suppression. And you can see that even now in Portland, where they're employing law enforcement on people and tear gassing people that aren't doing anything. Even they saw the visual when they were playing, I think it was the violin, and then the police came in and all of a sudden just, started tear gassing people. So the state suppression, and also creating fear in people is why movements can die. And so we have the stigmatization of protesters. So calling them criminals or calling them riots or rioters when it's not a riot. It's an uprising. So even the language that we're using, right, is a negative connotation. We should call anytime there's a celebration for the Stanley Cup and all that kind of stuff riots too, but we don't call it that, right? So this is an uprising when people are resisting something that has happened. And so what happens is you stigmatize these protesters, you start talking about that they are criminals, but you also try to threaten them or intimidate them or bodily harm. And we also see with movements, and sometimes you gain some wins, right? So the laws are being passed for accountability, you have some defunding, but this is not the end. And so I really wanted to drive home, but why movements die is because you see this kind of decreasing in the attention towards Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives. It's because of these things, and we're winning a little bit, but we need to keep up this movement. So sustainability of the movement, because as people have said multiple times, this isn't the first time this has happened. And so next. So some things that we need to do is take care of each other. So these are pictures that I took. And this is when people were being pepper sprayed. And so there's people there that were medics, they were bringing supplies, they were helping people that were being pepper sprayed. And it was a concern that everyone was okay. There was also protecting of vulnerable populations where people weren't able-bodied, might have some sort of disability that hindered them from doing something. Someone jumped in and like, I will help you. And so this concern that everyone's okay, this communal effect that happens at these protests, people don't want to talk about it, right? So the community-oriented goals and the local organizations are what make movement thrive. And they talked about earlier mutual aid, right? So helping each other, these networks that happen that are outside of the government. And so this has helped sustain the movement because we are helping each other out, we're creating community. But another thing that also needs to happen is we need to keep pressure on the government and policymakers, because once we get these little wins, people usually, piddle out, or they decide that they don't want to be a part of it anymore because they got something. So we need to keep the pressure on the government and policymakers. And also white allies need to keep this same energy that they're having and bring more people on to our side. We live in a white supremacist society. Therefore, many times it's only a white person that people actually start to hear what's actually being said. So even at the protests, they were chanting, white people get to the front, because that's when the SWAT team was coming towards us and the white people got up and went to the front. That's what you're supposed to do. You are putting your body between us and the police, us and people that will harm us, because they're less likely, to harm you than they would or to me. So when we talk about white allies, this energy needs to be kept up so that we can continue to thrive within this movement and gain more wins. Next. So lastly, I want to talk about self-care. So I didn't really talk much about things that I have done specifically, or my list of things I'm involved in. But one thing I want to talk about is Masks for Many, which me and a friend started, which we made masks for vulnerable populations for COVID. But what we also did was we decided to make masks for protesters. So we made masks for protesters, but we also raised money. We raised, a couple $100, almost $1,000, and we got supplies. So this is a sign that was made. So we had Gatorade, as you see, we had snacks, we had all these things to help protesters because it was hot and we need to sustain ourselves. And so Audre Lorde, I love this quote and I say it all the time, you know, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation and it's an act of political warfare. So we need to take care of ourselves. We are witnessing trauma. We are a part of trauma. This is trauma, being tear gassed, being shot by rubber bullets, seeing people die on the street, seeing these videos of people getting arrested and dying. Like, this is very traumatic. And so we need to take care of ourselves because, once again, I can't reiterate it enough, this has been going on for generations. And so people that have been in the long run, you know, who are, you know, John Lewis and all these people that, you know, are in their 80s and 90s that are still going, you know, they have been going for a reason, because this is something that is passionate to them. They want to help the next generation, and they've been doing it for you know, decades. And so if you're going to be in this for a long run, this is a decades long thing. Things are going to change in the next, you know, 6 months. And so, but you need to take care of yourself, because that they don't want us to take care of ourselves, because that means we'll be in it for the long run, right? We'll be here for a long time and we'll keep fighting and fighting. And so that concludes my talk. And I'm going to turn it over back to Dr. Muhammad to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gatewood. So much information that the entire panel gave. We want to thank you on behalf of Howard University and this partnership, which has been an amazing opportunity, and just wanting to make sure that you are reminded of your health, of your wellness, but also of the next generation. We're going to move now into a 2-minute pause, which will allow you guys to stand up, take a breath, but please make sure that you write your questions in your journal or put them in the Q&A. It may seem a little awkward that we're not, you know, on the screen, but this is a time to reflect and think. Please ask us anything. We look forward to seeing you in 1 minute to reflect and take comments and answer questions. Thank you so much.
First, I want to thank the DC team for their very powerful presentations, and I also want to thank the audience for submitting questions. Please continue to do so. This is our last Q&A of the teach-in, and after the Q&A with DC, Dr. Muhammad is going to share a few parting words about the power and meaning of vigil in the revolutionary moment that we're living in. We hope that you stay with us for those final thoughts, and we will also then conclude by inviting you to participate in a moment of silence with us. Dr. Muhammad started the DC group off by describing really the central role played by youth in this movement. And she wonders if we are in fact at a sort of tipping point in terms of real revolutionary change. She asked, what does it mean to be a child in this moment? How do we see, hear, and listen to Black children at this moment, seeing them as powerful, not as objects or objectified? How do we not just react, but create spaces in our homes, in our communities, to really hear from children who are living through this moment with us and who are also on the front lines of these struggles? Tony Lewis described the DC Native movement and efforts to erase African Americans from the city. And he talked at length about what was really required to make African Americans more visible in a city that many called Chocolate City. He described the broad efforts to improve the lives of Black DC residents, and specifically the range of government responses when met by an African American community that was demanding to not be silenced and to not be erased, and also the ways in which much of that community organizing was mobilized by Black youth. Anaya Vines focused on youth empowerment and how we raise up the next generation. She discussed her Black girl magic and also how to help all youth find their magic, their energy, their power. From her anti-gun violence work to balancing out her own movement activism with her educational responsibilities, she provides a sort of primer on organizing and movement building, including the work that she's doing on the Live movement and the HBCU March. And she reminds us that being an ally is more than just posting a Black screen. Dr. Brittany Gates then rounded out the DC presentation, reminding us that this movement is not new, and then really helping to center DC in this story and helping us to better understand how and why people come to this work. She explains, as systems lose their legitimacy, social movements are moments when the population, when citizens are attempting to sort of bridge that gap between the realities of the inequitable systems they're living in and the ideals of the type of world they'd like to live in. She also reminds us that movement membership is quite complicated. Movements can, on the one hand, be also challenged by state repression. Movements can also be challenged by their own successes. Dr. Gatewood also asks, how do we sustain this movement? Through care, through mutual aid, through community building? How do we continue to maintain pressure on elected officials? And how do we continue to maintain and promote real and not performative white allyship? So the question I'd like to start with for your group is, what do we need to do after November? If there is a new administration that is elected, do you think that the protests will continue to keep pressure on and hold elected officials accountable?
Anybody specifically want to address that? I was thinking Dr. Gatewood and also Tony Lewis Jr.
Yes. I think that what needs to happen at November is the same stuff happening right now. So what's going to happen, if you saw with the Obama administration, you know, there was some detrimental things that happened to Black people during Obama's administration, right? But you didn't like as much outrage, you know, as much because we have a Black president, all this kind of thing. You know, if let's say Biden wins or anything like that, people like, oh, we'll do, but then they'll stop. But there's different levels of the government. There's different branches. Things affect you on the local level. Not everything on the federal level is going to trickle down as quickly as things happening on your local level. So their pressure still needs to stay up the way it is going now past November. It needs to go until we get everything that we are asking for. And so we shouldn't stop now. We should keep protesting, keep trying to get legislation through, and all these things that we are trying to promote equity, you know, for resources within the Black community, because these systems were built upon white supremacy and patriarchy. So there, you have to break that down, right? It's not just going to go overnight that we're, you know, Black people are going to be equal. We're going to have all the same resources of other people. No, something's not going to take, you know, generations to go through, because it took generations to get us here. It's going to take some time to undo that system.
Yeah, and I would add, not a whole lot, by the way, but just that we must continue to press forward. if we do change parties in terms of our leadership in this country, then I think the Democrats owe up. They owe up big. I think we will be able to say, as a community, we delivered the election, and so there needs to be, some payback for that. We have to continue to amplify our voices. And the one thing that I would also say is that I think it's important that in this moment, as we talk about youth leaders, that Naya spoke to me as an older leader, which I'm cool with, is that we need succession plans. We need to pass on knowledge and get out the way, because I think it is important for people, and it's time for people like myself and people to take on our role, whatever that next role would be. But sometimes that grassroots, on the ground, in the valley, as she described it, leadership needs to be right there in that energy, in that time. So, and I think the generation before us didn't do a great job of that, right? I think they stayed too long, if you will. And so, as we go to November and beyond, we have to continue to press forward for equity, for reparations, for everything that we need. And again, I'm looking forward to what's next for us as a community.
Thank you so much. A question from our audience. Any thoughts about white allyship and the missteps around the wall of moms groups popping up around the country that often lack Black leadership? And I'm just going to add on to that question, a question about the role of Latinos, Asian Americans, Indigenous peoples as allies in these current struggles for racial justice.
I see you smiling, Dr. Gatewood. So I'm gonna let you jump into that, and I'll piggy onto something. Anaya, did you want to add anything into that after? Okay.
I want to say, just because you're a person of color doesn't mean you're not pro-Black. You can be anti-Black and a person of color. And so, Latinos, Latinx, you have, Indigenous, all, and so the thing about especially capitalism, Dr. Brewer talked about a little bit, but it is for exploitation of Black and brown people, right? And so the fact that we're pitted against each other is so we can't come together. That is done on purpose, right? So if you separate us, we won't be able to come together and go towards who's actually oppressing us. We live in a white supremacist, patriarchal society, so why aren't we all fighting for that? And then when you talk about white allyship, people do things that are sexy, right? I'm going to go to this protest. I'm going to, make this sign, do this post, but you're not doing stuff for the long run. So if you're talking about white allyship, you need to be in the trenches of things that are done on a day-to-day basis. It's not just going to a protest. There's things behind the scenes that are happening, right? And I was talking about, organizing a march. You can help organize, right? There's flyers that need to be passed out, educating other white people, right? And reading books, and also, especially with the money that I was talking about that was given to HBCUs, it's just given. I highly doubt, and I don't know for sure, that, it's they're working with the day-to-day. It's here's the money, do with it, what we kind of see fit to make this equal, instead of like, okay, are you going to work with us? What things do we need to put in place and make this more of an approach where it helps build fundamental things that's going to help in the long run, not just here's money and that's it. And that's what a lot of like, here's this and I'm backing away because I did what I was supposed to do. I gave you money. Or now, I don't know if anyone else has happened to, now white people give me stuff like, oh, do you want water? You want this? I'm good. Like, where were you 5 years ago? So just the fact of talking about just not doing the sexy kind of stuff, and also getting in the grassroots and organizing and doing those things from the ground is very important for longevity of this movement.
And I would just add to that to say that, specifically for the mom group, it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to do the work without Black women, without the leadership of Black women. And oftentimes we find that our white allies can engage with our Black brothers a little bit easier than they can with the Black women because of just the voice and the, lack of resolve and, the strong tongue and just the sharing of the truth. So I would just say that be patient with the process. Know that when you engage with Black women, you will hear a hard truth of information that may cause you to need to go back and read, but it is not an opportunity to counterattack or to become, more vicious in this kind of fight against this inequality, because it's clear here what is going on. And so it does take time. You're talking about individuals that have been hurt and buried and disregarded for generations after generation after generation. And oftentimes an individual's naiveness or inability to see their privilege may not be coddled. You know, oftentimes individuals don't dummy themselves down or engage in a dialogue in a way that feels good for you. Just know that if you are engaging in a dialogue and it doesn't feel good, you can go back, you can do your research, you can re-engage in different conversations, you can go, there's gonna be a strategy in the same way that it's a long-term for those individuals on the front line. In order to gain the respect from Black women, it is going to take time, and it's going to take a true commitment. And for those of you that are true to this game and are really out there to be on the front lines and really be for this movement, you'll still be there during the time, and it will allow for an opportunity to work together. So I would just say hang in there and reach out to Black sisters, because you can't do the work by yourself. It doesn't even look right anymore.
Just to kind of end it, I would kind of piggyback off of what Brittany said. Fighting for racial justice is not a trend. This is something that is not, like she said, it's not new. I will give respect to people who are doing the work. I don't want people, I'm not going to give respect for people who aren't, you know, doing what they've been saying or claiming they've been saying, or taking photos in the middle of a march and then leaving and only going there for a photo op to post on Instagram. And that's also directed to my generation as well. We need to find the power that we have as youth and use that power consistently until we actually see change. And I would even say to the mothers, what are you teaching to your children? So, you know, things that you are claiming you support, the questions that your children might be asking you, how are you answering those? Are you teaching them things that they need to know so that when they go into society, they actually know what they're walking into? Are you teaching your children to be allies? If you are allies, is that something that you are changing? Because that racist mindset is something that is taught, you know, from the cradle. So it's something that is bred. So make sure that your household is representing what you're saying, or are you really, you know, doing what you're claiming to do? But yeah, that's really what I would say. Make sure that you're just not walking the walk, but you're actually talking the talk, finding a way to get into this movement and be as effective as possible.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our DC Collaborative, Dr. Muhammad, Tony Lewis, Anaya Vines, Dr. Gatewood. Thank you for an excellent set of presentations and a wonderful Q&A. I also want to thank our audience for being with us today. And I want to close today's teach-in by, again, thanking you and inviting our audience and all of us to remember what brought us here, what brought us to this teach-in, what's brought us to this moment. And those are the murders of George Floyd, Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks. The list is too long. And I'm going to invite Dr. Muhammad to share a last few words with us about vigil and about the meaning of vigil in protest and as a form of community healing. And I want to invite the audience after Dr. Muhammad speaks, and there's going to be a short slideshow of vigils from around our country to just sit with us for a moment of silence at the end of this teach-in. And again, thank you all.
Thank you all for your participation. I am honored to lead the dialogue around vigils, and I've spent the last few weeks just reading about all of the different vigils across the nation and also around the world. And oftentimes, when we think about vigils, we think about religious components, and oftentimes we feel that we understand it, right? We feel that we have some sense of an understanding of what it means. But there's a deeper level to it, right? There is this concept of being able to feel the spirit and the energy of what vigils really mean. When you look at the definition, things as simple as devotional watching or religious observance, wakefulness. Oftentimes the vigils happen during a time of night when individuals are sleeping, and it's built on this concept that there is something so wrong in our world and in our lives that we can't sleep, that we must remain up, we must remain in thought, we must remain focused, and therefore a vigil is a message. Please understand that it is an easy thing to identify the bodies of individuals, but an offset of the particular bodies and the representation that you see in vigils is a spirit, it is a legacy, and it is a testament not only to those individuals that we lost, but to their families. Mr. George Floyd, we heard that he called for his mother. And so these vigils that pop up all across the nation are not only for him and to represent the voices that are silenced and that are muzzled to death, but also to the living family. Make sure that you don't culture vulture as it relates to taking pictures and images of these vigils, hanging them in your homes without a full explanation of what it means. Every flower, every teddy bear, every candle, regardless of the color, if it's a white candle, it means something. If it's yellow, if it's red, if it's green, if it's blue, there's an entire history that dates very, very far back, covers different nationalities, different religions, different modes of life. A vigil is a representation of a commitment to the life of the movement. And when I say the life of the movement, I mean that it is immortal. Oftentimes we've seen in the news that law enforcement officers come in and stomp on the grounds of these sacred spaces, that they disregard the individuals that are placing different items there, that they identify and call on family members 20 minutes before they come to have everything removed because they claim that it is the thing that is causing the unrest. It is the voice of the silent, and you are to appreciate it through your eyes and also through your ears. Ask individuals what it means. Engage with the Black and Brown community around their reasons for creating certain things. And please be reminded to never think that you can tell the story from the vantage point of an individual that does not live in that melanated skin. And that's not to take anything away from anyone, but it is to attribute the artistry to those individuals that created it. I want to make sure that all of you log on to the website for the particular teach-ins and make sure that you stay tuned to hear from other artists in the near future from this particular group that talk about the stories behind what was created. And again, as you see this vigil play itself out in front of you, look at what it's saying to you, just in the imagery, in the colors, and also through the pain. When individuals place thousands of candles in an area, that is what we call unity. And if you look at our bodies and say that we are just flesh and blood and we can be disposed of, we will leave beautiful images to remind you of our sacredness, of our beauty, and most importantly, of our humanity. Please join us in viewing this vigil from across the nation, but also please join us in a moment of silence. Thank you so much for listening to us. And this is just a chip and just a start of a long history of work that will need to continue to happen, not only among these groups, but among our families, in our households, and with our children. Thank you.